of Kenya, and I wish to welcome you for today's session. This is a follow-up of yesterday's session. We are having the 3-day Urban Thinkers Campus, which is an initiative of Aak-Unhabitat, and the AAK is hosting this year's Urban Thinkers Campus. So the Urban Thinkers Campus is an initiative of the Aak-Unhabitat, as I've mentioned, and it's conceived as an open space for critical exchange between urban researchers, professionals, and decision makers who believe that urbanization is an opportunity and can lead to positive transformation. The Urban Thinkers Campus is intended as a platform to build consensus between partners engaged in addressing urbanization challenges and proposing solutions for the urban future. And this is exactly what we started off yesterday by having a discussion. And in the afternoon, we had a very interactive session where we brainstormed in breakout sessions. So the idea is just to address much of what is going on in the world, and especially for this Urban Thinkers Campus, looking at urbanization in Africa, the issue of rapid urban growth, which is happening in towns and secondary cities. And this is where actually the social and economic transformations are taking place. So the idea is just to look at these secondary cities, mainly located along the coast, which struggle to accommodate rapid expansion. Of course, the issue of immigration from rural to urban areas, and the issue of man-made and natural environmental hazards. So the idea of this campus is to look at how we can build resilience in these secondary cities, which is important for achieving country-level development objectives, as well as linking the cities with the rural areas. So for this campus, we are also intending to have discussions relating to urban resilience and how we can best achieve the SDG goals and the new urban agenda. So the primary objectives of this campus are 3. So we have 3 objectives. The first one being establishing an understanding of the challenges of sustainability and resilient urban development. And secondly, analyzing the steering mechanisms and instruments of urban resilience. And thirdly, developing appropriate strategies and measures necessary for achieving urban resilience, especially in third world countries. So this is exactly where we started off yesterday. Yesterday we had full day engagements. We had keynote speakers in the morning, where we were joined by our own president, architect and planner Mugure Jendu, who is the AAK president. We also have Thomas, who's the president of the International Union of Architects, UIA. We have Carrie Duncan, who is the IFRA president. She's a landscape architect and an urban planner as well. And we have Martin Dublin, who is the current president of ISOCAP. This is the International Society of City and Regional Planners. So welcome for today's session. I will start you off by giving you a summary of the main discussions that we had yesterday. And then immediately after, we'll start the panel discussion. And then we'll have the second panel discussion, which will be at around 11:30. Then we'll break the day sessions at 1 p.m. So allow me just to give you a short preview of the main proceedings or the main conclusions of yesterday's proceedings. And as I said, today we are going to have 2 sessions, and then tomorrow we are going to have what we are calling the action day, where we'll come up with the main resolutions that will forward to the Aak-Unhabitat as key areas of action. So from yesterday's session, the keynote session, where we had the 4 presidents, as I had mentioned, Mugure Jendu of AAK president, we had the president of International Union of Architects, the IFRA president, and the president of ISOCAP. And the main take-home points was we need to invest more in public spaces and green infrastructure. We need to make our metropolitan areas, cities, towns, and urban areas to be more livable for children, the elderly, and the disabled, and for everyone else. This is just a call for more inclusive urban design and planning. We need to find a balance to develop when integrating nature. The call here was going back to the basics, working around nature, as nature has proved it has a way of facilitating resilience. And the other con was for us to go back to, not to go back to what we termed as normal. Some of the gains that we have already made, we have seen a lot of reduction in air emissions, in greenhouse emissions. We've seen a lot of good things that have come from working from home, having virtual meetings as we are having today. Otherwise would have been convened somewhere physically and would have all driven our cars or used matatus or used any other means of transport to convey at one physical location, triggering a lot of emissions. We've also had very good lessons on proper hygiene and improved service provision, among others. So these are things that we should not just let them go. We should pull them even as we move to post-COVID-19 era. We also need to think differently to provide solutions that allow the people in that particular society to participate fully as they best understand their situation, their solutions that can have that can be sustainably implemented using local knowledge, skills, and materials. So again, the con here is for us as professionals, especially, and experts in our own field, to find a way of working with the local people, the Mwananchi, to tap into their knowledge, to fully understand their situation, and really like run with them in terms of using the local skills and materials that they have. And this was also a call for the academicians in terms of their scientific findings. There should be something that can easily be implemented on the ground. Again, the con here was for us as professionals in the built environment to fully engage in the implementation of the SDGs and the new urban agenda fully. And the con here was, as designers and planners, we need to accelerate our contribution to the SDGs through design. And the conclusion here was architecture, design, and planning can improve the human conditions and our planet. The question, ladies and gentlemen, that we were left with from this session was whether we want just to engage on the physical form and the material elements, or whether we should take action on the economy, the society, the culture, and governance, and more so, whether as professionals, we should engage in politics. So moving forward to the second session, that was session 1, where we had a panel discussion and we had a presentation on sustainable cities, integrated urban mobility and planning. And we also had lessons from Mombasa County. And the message here was to be smart and to simplify. So be smart, simplify. So we're called on to do things a bit differently. And the message here was, if we continue business as usual, we are on a dangerous trajectory, which will lead to unsustainable development. And we have to acknowledge that intervening when we already have a built environment is not easy, but we have to move from complex urban structures into sustainable spatial planning, sustainable urban mobility and form, to an organized complexity. So the idea here is to appreciate that, yes, we have already built environment in most scenarios, but we have to see how we can organize the complexity and the chaos around what is already developed to achieve more resilient and sustainable development. And the new concept that I liked from this message was that urban life consists of 2 elements that embraces all the functions, all the acts of that live, and that is the man, which is the being, and the man that is moving. So the being and the moving, and all acts being or acts man are verified by the capacities materially or virtually occupied by buildings. And buildings is what we are known to design and plan for. And when all things moving take place in undefined spaces called streets. And streets is where, again, we have a lot of planning, a lot of urban design, a lot of engineering in terms of coming up with streets that are actually facilitating the moving, but also facilitating the being by being spaces that can be termed as public spaces that accommodate life apart from just the movement. We also have new urban models that are needed in the 21st century. We realize the need for isolation, the need for social distancing in the midst of congested cities, in the midst of inadequate housing, and in the midst of limited street spaces. So even as we move forward, as we talk of resilience, we have to think of our urban spaces, of how we can accommodate the new challenges that we have learned from the COVID-19 era. So again, the call here was for sustainable urban design and mobility, integrating land uses, transport planning, putting in financing, and seeing basically how we can work around that. So session 2, we also had a very good discussion along the coastal cities resilience and some of the initiatives which are taking place in the coast. We had a lot about the impact of the mangrove, of the cutting down of the mangrove, of the interference of the breeding, the fish breeding areas, the loss of critical biodiversity that is happening, and some of the initiatives that are being taken just to curb some of these bad effects that is happening. Of course, we also had a discussion around the NAPSET project, which is a major project, but we also know it's going to impact significantly in biodiversity. So we have to mitigate against the high cost of NAPSET infrastructure and the high cost or the high impact that it's going to have on the community livelihoods. And some of the ways that this can be done is actually incorporating the local people into the design of this infrastructure, into the design of these developments, and seeing also how they can come up with their livelihoods around the projects, while having that balance between environment and economy as such. We also had very good initiatives which were presented from Tana River in terms of how they're developing a prototype resilient structure or a building that can withstand flooding, and this capitalize on the use of natural resources and skills. We also had very good initiatives of the World Wildlife Fund, WWF, of how they are working with the counties in the coastal regions, that's Kwale, Lamu and Kilifi, to integrate resilient aspects and resilient projects in the county spatial plans. So we ended this session by a call by Planner Annie Budzuma from Kwale County. And he says urban resilience goes beyond just the built environment and must be all-encompassing to include all other aspects such as the economy and social interactions. Of course, from this session, we also had architect George Arabu, who represented the AAK Flood Resilient Task Force, which is a task force which was constituted by AAK as an initiative of having action-oriented solutions for the flooding. And the idea here was just to see how they can work with communities. Of course, the complexity of it, because most people ask, why can't you just move these people to higher grounds? But flooding is here with us to stay. These are people who are living in their ancestral homes. We are also having a lot of impact from climate change. So it's something which is going to be here for us for a long time as we tackle the main cause of these flooding issues. So we had the preliminary findings from this task force And we had the results of the design competitions, which are out and available on the AAK YouTube channel and website. The Secretariat will provide a link for where you can access the results of this competition in the chat box. And the call here was for professionals and organizations to support this task force as it intends to move to the ground, to Budalangi, to Tananiva and other flood-prone areas, to really connect the data and design with the people and have a pilot resilient structure that can now be adopted in these other areas. Of course, depending with the resources that they have, the materials that they can access. And they were just calling on support to raise approximately 1.5 million shillings to cover the field expenditures and also tap on the expertise. So if you're out there and you'd like to volunteer your time and your resources to this initiative, please contact the AAK Secretariat. Again, the contacts will be provided in the chat box. So the challenge here to professionals is to go beyond the rhetoric of formulating policies and applying them, and really taking in time to formulate and actively engage in action. So in the afternoon sessions, we had the urban labs where we had 2 breakout sessions, and they really engaged to come out with solutions. These solutions were presented yesterday, and I will not go into the details of this because they will present again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So allow me just to close these open remarks and summary of yesterday's summary, and really call on us as we engage in this second day of the Urban Thinkers Campus to really focus on solutions, to really focus on areas of action that we can undertake and participate in. So without further ado, allow me to welcome landscape architect Ambrose Ofafa, who is the chair of the Landscape Architects chapter at the AAK, to lead the first panel discussion. Karibu Ofafa.
Thank you very much, Planner Juliet Ritter, for inviting me to moderate this session. Just as you've heard, my name is Ambrose Ofafa. I am a landscape architect. I am the chairperson of the Landscape Architecture chapter in AAK, and it's my pleasure to moderate this session. I'll straight away introduce the panelists who are ready with me here with a lot of knowledge, and I can see from their faces energy as well. I'll start by introducing architect Professor Alfred Omenya, who is already here with us. We also have Robin Emerson. We have George Wesonga. Probably if you could just wave to the viewers. Just wave to the viewers. And then I want to give you a bios to them, and then we can start this session. And I'll start with Professor Alfred.
I think we lost him.
Hello? Hello?
Yes, Ofafa, we can hear you now. You can proceed.
Sorry for that hitch. So I'll start again. Architect Professor Alfred Omenya is a practicing architect and sustainable human settlement expert. He is the principal researcher and CEO of EcoBuild Africa, which was cited by the World Bank as a leading resource for sustainable urban development for developing countries. He has been an associate professor and head of school of the built environment at the Technical University of Kenya. He previously taught at the University of the Witwatersrand, that is in South Africa, and the University of Nairobi here in Kenya, where he still serves as an external examiner. He helped establish schools of the built environment in Rwanda, Malawi, and South Africa. He has published over 90 academic papers and remains external examiner in various universities. He started professional practice at the Planning System Services here in Kenya, and also worked with the Sync Consult in South Africa. He has designed hundreds of commercial, residential, and hospitality projects in Kenya, Uganda, and a few in South Africa. He was the lead consultant for the new Green Master Plan for United Nations headquarters in Nairobi here in Kenya, and was identified by the International Union of Architects as a major opinion shaper on the future of sustainable architecture. Professor Omenya was also lead author for the African Union Vision 2063 on urban development. He is currently the lead consultant in development of building regulations incorporating sustainability, climate change, and disaster risk management for the Republic of Malawi, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and the Republic of Uganda. Locally, Professor Omenya is supporting the Kenyan Urban Support Program, the Sustainable Urban Economic Development Program for Kenya, and the Program Management Office for the post-COVID recovery. I'd just like to announce to the audience, this is just a summary of who Professor Omenya is. You can multiply this by 1,000 to really know who he is. I've just picked out, in the interest of time, what is important in our discussion today. I'll go to Robin. Robin Emerson. Robin Emerson is the founding president of the Women in Real Estate, that is called WIRE, here in Kenya. He's an urban planner and participatory engagement organizing practitioner who has initiated several programs and interventions that transform the whole communities and segments thereof in Kenya and the US. She authored the Kibera Blueprint for Comprehensive Redevelopment, for comprehensive development, sorry about that. She is board member of the Build Her, organization that empowers women, empowers Kenyan women through connective advocacy, accredited construction skills, and life skills training to employment. And founding advisor of Mawe to Maendeleo, that is COVID-19 spurred social enterprise that creates new livelihood opportunities for unemployed domestic workers, and the former CEO of Kenya Property Development Association. Just like Professor Omenya, Robin, this is probably just about 1/10 of who you are. In the interest of time, people, the audience can multiply this by 100 to really know who you are. George Osonga is the Executive Officer, Civil Society of Urban Development Platform Kenya. He is an experienced urban manager with over 25 years senior level experience in the Kenyan and East African urban sector. Experienced in management, the programming in local authorities, civil societies, networks, and regional local governments such as Lake Victoria Regional Local Authorities Corporation. He is a member of National Project Steering Committee Sustainable Urban Economic Development Program, that is UK-AID. He is the Chief Executive Officer for the Civil Society Urban Development Platform, which specializes in partnership, building for action, capacity development, and innovation in policy and governance advocacy. He is also the co-secretary of the Global Stakeholder Advisory Group of Aak-Unhabitat and a member of the National Program Steering Committee of the Sustainable Urban Economic Development Program of the UK government in Kenya. He is also the national convener of the Just City Working Group in Kenya. Wasonga is passionate about inclusive urbanism, where all are treated with the dignity and respect. He holds masters from UEM in the Netherlands. Welcome, George Wasonga. So without further ado, I'll go straight away to our discussions today about this topic of resilience. And without wasting time, I think I will start with you, Robin Emerson, to give us an insight of how resilient is Kenya in urban planning, please.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ofafa. And thank you, AAK and the leadership and Madam Juliet. Very, very honored to be on this esteemed panel on this important topic. I did participate yesterday. I sat in on yesterday's session. I think that the panelists that were there in the two labs, I participated in one of the lab groups as well. You know, as we were talking about what is resilience, and then more specifically in our coastal cities. But I think what was interesting, and as I think about, I went further and went and thought about this resilience, this idea of resilience. And someone yesterday talked about, you know, as we use the word sustainable development, and we keep referring to the SDGs. And someone pointed out poignantly that as we use that word sustainable, it means that we want something to stay as it is, to sustain, if you will. And one of the people were saying that, is that the case? Do we want things to stay as they are? And so I think that that's one of the questions that I even think, hopefully will be opening up in this Urban Thinkers campus, is what do we mean when we're talking about a sustainable development? And, maybe perhaps as I looked up some synonyms for the sustainable, it's viable, some other uses of that word. But I think that, when we look at resilient cities in Kenya, and how are we designing multi-hazard resilient cities in Kenya? And as Juliet mentioned, we're talking about professionals working in the public sphere. And so a resilient city has several components. So let me just kind of touch on two things here, Ofafa, real quick. So resilient cities has a couple of things. One, a resilient cities is have four drivers to it. And those four drivers are economy, governance, the environment, and society. And so we have to take into the whole thought and the whole thinking about in totality, what a resilient city comprises of. And so when we look at the economy, are we talking about the growth and the jobs and the so forth? In the governance, are we talking about clear leadership and management? And then when we talk about the environment, is it an ecosystem that is sound and that is diverse? And then in our societies, are we looking at this, that are people having healthy lives? Are we looking at neighborhoods? Are we looking at citizens networks being active? And so that's one of the things that I want us to think about when we look at a resilient city. And if we were to start to create even a metrics or some type of index that measures some of these things about Kenyan cities, where would our cities fall and where would they measure on some of this? But the other thing, Ofafa, I wanted to bring up is when we talk about resilient cities, resilience, they talk about it in three ways. We talk about it, the engineering of resilience, the ecological systems resilience, and then the physical nature of things in terms of resilience. But in resilient oriented planning, if you will, we need to address the dynamics and the complexity of urban systems, the dynamic nature of them and the complexity of them. And so when we need to talk about in urban cities, resilience is really talking about the capacity to adapt, and what some people have been talking about, the capacity to bounce back, if you will, the capacity to have a shock, take a hit, have something that happens in a community or in a city, and for it to absorb that, if you will, for it to return back to something. And so the question that I want to ask, on this panel, and as we're talking here, do we really want to adapt back to something, or do we want to move to an adapting forward? Right? How are we taking what happens to us and how are we learning and implementing that? And then we adapt forward so that we really are moving forward. So that does take some paradigm shifting. And that talks namely about our strategy making. How are we strategizing around cities? Public participation, equity, empowerment, learning, the traditional ways that we learn and so forth. How are we moving that needle? And so I just want to open that up when we talk about resilient cities. And so if I'll leave this as my first comment, if you will, what's the stress testing that we're doing regularly on our cities? What's the stress testing that tells us what their capacity loads are? And what are we making available for us to be resilient? I'll hand that back over, Afafa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that. And I like actually the last part that you really stressed on, bouncing back or adapting forward. I really like that. And with that in mind, Professor Omenya, with that in mind, when we want to really bounce back and move forward, prior to the coronavirus pandemic, then the endemic lack of decent housing in low-income countries already constituted a global emergency. At least 1.2 billion people in substandard housing and 300 million new homes are required by 2030 to bridge the deficit. As more people around the world are asked to stay at home and practice social distancing to contain COVID-19, it is more apparent than ever that adequate housing is a matter of life and death here. In your opinion, what is the significance of housing for tackling diseases in Kenya, in diseases in Kenyan cities, the essential role affordable housing must play in the region's post-pandemic recovery as a form of sustainable, resilient infrastructure? Professor Menya.
No, thank you very much, Ofafa Ambrose and fellow panelists, Robin and George, whom I know pretty well, and we're working very closely. In fact, George and I were in the same meeting. Just stepped out to attend this, and AK for this campus, AK and the Aak-Unhabitat. Ofafa, you ask the role of housing, and I think I want to start this by making a generic point that the biggest challenge we have is confusing housing with houses. You know, if you start looking at housing as a collection of buildings, then you miss the point altogether. And then the question as to you know, the resilience, relationships with health and so on, then is actually lost. So of course, when you're talking about housing, we are basically talking largely about the house and the entire environment that that is created, that humans actually live in terms of residential accommodation. We are looking at the infrastructure, we are looking at the services, we are looking at the open spaces, we are looking at the play areas for children, we are looking at you know, spaces between the buildings and so on. Yeah, so I think part of the issue is that when we look at the deficit and even inadequate housing, and Aak-Unhabitat has done a lot of work in this, sometimes policymakers tend to assume that it is lack of buildings, but buildings we actually have. In Kenya, everywhere in South Africa, I'm working in Afghanistan, the buildings are there, that's not an issue. But the overall environment that is created as a housing environment, the quality of servicing and so on, becomes very problematic. We did a study actually, and we shared this with Aak-Unhabitat, that showed that, and this was long before COVID, that up to 70% of child mobility, child sicknesses, was linked directly with environmental quality in terms of waste management, in terms of sanitation, and so on. So the quality of the housing environment becomes very, very important. And especially now we are seeing it with COVID, that on one hand, we need a relatively highly serviced environment that can guarantee people's health. We know, for example, even in Kenya, one of the biggest response, we couldn't do social distancing, but one of the biggest response the government did was to provide water and sanitation, and that actually had an impact. So what you're talking about here is to create environments that, housing environments that are very well serviced. Hence the problem with defining the housing deficit. We know, for example, that part of the challenges that we have in many developing countries, Kenya included, are what I may call unsustainable densities. People are packed in very small spaces. They're packed in high-rise buildings. There's no spaces for people to move around and so on. We can't do social distancing in those sort of spaces. And then, of course, adding on to that are other problems. Those spaces, the houses themselves are very poorly ventilated. There's very poor sanitation. There is no water provision, and so on and so forth. Part of our studies have actually shown that rural environments are actually healthier. And they're healthier because, simply because the densities and the overall quality of the environment is superior to the urban slums and informal settlements. Yes, I think we need to start tackling housing from those broader issues of service provision. We need to start tackling housing from quality of life. We need to start tackling housing from provision of adequate services like water and sanitation and waste management. We need to start tackling housing from social amenities and social infrastructure, places where children can play and so on. And then eventually, of course, we'll get directly onto the quality of the house itself, which is the material that is used to build the house, which is the quality of paint, which is natural ventilation in those places, which is daylighting. And of course, you're very familiar with this, the whole idea of biophilic architecture. and creating architecture and environments that promote human health. Yeah, so our countries need to focus. In summary, what I'm saying here is that the big link between housing and health has everything to do with the quality of the housing environment and the quality and level of services, as opposed to the brick and mortar of the house, which is also important nonetheless. Yeah, let me make those as my opening remarks to your question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Menya, for that insightful, insightful points that you've given us. That when it comes to housing, we look at houses and the entire environment that comes with the houses to actually form quality housing. And I know probably in what you've mentioned deeply as a landscape architect, I'm also picking out outdoor quality that is very key in tackling housing issues, especially during this time of this pandemic. Robin, infrastructure and related utilities are important for the resilience of modern cities, as may have been alluded by Professor Menya. Nevertheless, presentations from different speakers yesterday indicated that such projects may degrade the natural ecosystem, e.g. the Port of Mombasa, the Nairobi Expressway. Is there any recourse for Kenyan cities to overcome this challenge beyond the narrative of planting trees, as have been the case with some of these projects? Just unmute yourself, Robbie. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that question. It does appear that planting of trees has become the what do you call it? If you will, to pull a intervention off of a shelf. If there were shelves that were, all kind of interventions there, that does seem to be the one that we continue to go and grab, if you will. And continue to do that. That's it's a wonderful intervention. It's something that is needed. But one of the things I think I want to task my fellow professionals in the built environment is, are we? I'm curious if there's something that is putting a lid on our collective creativity. Is there something that is putting a lid on our collective as professionals in the built environment, our collective creativity? And so I'm really throwing that out there. So I don't know if I necessarily want to come with direct answers. I think I want to be more provocative to us as professionals. How do they train fleas, if you will? Do you know how they train fleas not to jump beyond where they think they can jump? Ofafa or anyone else? You can put fleas in a bottle or a jar, and you can put the lid on that jar, put the fleas in there. The fleas will jump, they'll hit their head. They'll jump, they'll hit their head on that top. Ofafa, you can take that top off of that same jar, and the fleas will not jump beyond. They will not jump beyond that jar. And so, when we talk about resilient cities and we talk about, the work that I've done in several cities around Kenya, we can put in a lot of work, but then we get pushback from the government, if you will. It doesn't work, or things don't happen, or we see the corruption and so forth. And are we getting tired? And are we pulling back from our creativity and coming up with some of these answers? That's one of the questions I kind of feel like. So when we talk about infrastructure and other things, the innovation, the ideas, we're not lacking of those. But I'm curious, if we want to be a resilient city and we want to come in and address some of these things, how do we push through some of the challenges that might be giving us inertia, if you will, to be able to come up and implement some of these innovative infrastructure ideas that we know that would make a difference?
Thank you for that, Robin. I'm sure after this discussion, the fleas that are inside the jar are going to be told, hey, you can fly, come out. We need to make a difference. We need to make a change. And I fully agree with you. George Osonga, the most effective strategies to COVID-19 are regular hand washings, avoiding close contact with others, and sheltering in places. For those fortunate enough to live in comfortable, secure housing with adequate space and services, this advice is easy to follow. what happens to the underprivileged section of the society? And are there initiatives that CSUDP has undertaken to help this vulnerable section of the population during this pandemic?
Thank you very much, Ambrose Ofafa. And indeed, it's a pleasure to be amongst the esteemed panelists, Prof, a very close friend, actually, who we have been engaging government on certain aspects in the urban areas and cities regulations. And AAK and Aak-Unhabitat, of course, for organizing this Urban Thinkers Campus, reminds me really of the Urban October month, and an invitation I had alongside with the CS, Eugene Omalwa, when we were engaging with grassroots women under the Ohio Commission. And the core discussion generally was, how do we link this grassroots innovations and agenda with, for instance, bigger platforms like the forthcoming Afri-Cities that is being hosted by Kisumu in November next year, and will be the sort of marketplace where everybody is showcasing their best food and learning from the others. So what space do we have for them? So I want to recite my response to you on what I normally call my 3 S's, and that's the social construct of this in the privileged areas, the social psyche of this and the privileged communities, and of course the social orientation. And for what's interesting for me as a good analogy to give the value around the social construct is if you look at the protocols that really are communing around us combating COVID-19, social distancing, hygiene, sanitizing, and so on and so forth. These are the kind of remote things that are not constructed within the social manner in which the underprivileged communities reside. And therefore, from the outset, it becomes an immediate challenge. And one of the things that we obviously then see around that is, how do we immediately, in terms of first line of response, deconstruct that? And one is coming in and saying, amongst the frontline actors coming in, we've got to first move away from this sort of jurisdictional element of I belong or appeal to this segment of community in Kibera and Matari and so on, and just sort of construct ourselves as one force and say, what is the biggest benefit we can bring to accrue to the existing circumstances that are constructed within societies. The second element that I want to engage with is the social psyche. And Professor Menya and I sometimes have been discussing this agenda around what is the sense of belonging, for instance, for some of our people living in the underprivileged areas in terms of the urban landscape. And it's as temporal as one saying, I invest my time to extract resources from the urban area and take this back to my rural enclave where perhaps I enjoy more freedom and space. And you could see that with the lockdown issues, when there was basically a clear intention that if it hadn't caught people unawares, there would have been a massive exodus, and a lot of it from the people living in the underprivileged areas, sort of taking flight from the city, for that matter. So the question there still becomes, is our psyche urban, sufficiently urban, to then reside ourselves and engage with all these urban features? The third element that I wanted to then bring up is a social orientation, and to manage pandemics like COVID that came up, one of the things that one needs to look at is what are the easy fixes? And some of the easy fixes is quickly saying, stay at home. I mean, for somebody in an underprivileged area, first of all, that home is not home to start with. So it's extremely, I mean, it's not matching for them to say, I can spend my 24 hours within, or rather indoors for that matter. Because one, the orientation is that the quality of that environment itself is already compromised in many ways. Now, having said that, let me come back to, as you asked, what are the initiatives that then sprang in place to sort of try and reduce the risk, so to say, of these exposed communities? Because by nature, as I said, of the social construct, the psyche, and the orientation, they're already predisposed to more danger in terms of a pandemic strike like what we had. So one was obviously a very quick realization, and I think this was beneficial for us when I look at it in hindsight, of all actors sort of dropping their jurisdictional guard and saying, hey, this is a threat to humanity. It's no longer something that says, I will attack more the vulnerable and leave the elites out of it. So deconstructing the suspicions, sometimes between government and civil society organizations, and just creating a coordination framework. And one example that I want to actually cite is the one that was coordinated through the community division and the Ministry of Health, County Government of Nairobi, and numerous non-state agencies that basically came in to support frontline action. And the actions were basically, how do we thread in the culture of people must then observe better hygiene? How do we cushion these vulnerable communities from the fact that they're not able to earn their daily income, and therefore we still want them to stay in their locale? And how do we just sort of give a fair incentive structure for them to stay within that area? So that coordination, national coordination mechanism was very interesting. But the second point again around that was, how do you start to bring up various efforts that are perhaps looking like the good practices? And we used a platform we have called the Local Urban Forums that are basically in 21 counties in Kenya, to sort of be our sort of information source. What is happening on the ground in these vulnerable communities? How are people coping with the situations? Is there anything we can learn from it immediately so that it can inform how others therefore respond to their scenarios? And that exchange platform really worked pretty well with very active exchanges on real time, actually, what was happening. A third engagement that we had, which I think was also quite useful, was an institutional oriented engagement where we were in partnership with Aak-Unhabitat and facilitated an institutional coordination arrangement with Kisumu County. And this was purely targeted at the informal settlements. And the key thing here was COVID-19 is not necessarily only a health issue. It was in the beginning, but suddenly it's taking an economic angle, it's taking a social angle. There's gender-based violence. There's interruptions of people's social psyches and so on. And we said, let's have a comprehensive approach to this. So what was necessary first was, how do we have data that tells us real time what the changes and the patterns in these vulnerable communities are looking like? And how and who do we have in our basket that has the competence and ability to quickly respond to that? And thirdly, do we have some resource in terms of an emergency resource that can support that particular response? And I think the Kisumu example for me, as I wind up, was one fairly unique one. There's very, very interesting lessons to learn from that. So finally, in terms of concluding, is that it was very important, looking at the COVID experience and resilience, to first come into a space where we say, let's do a social deconstruct. And that means both within the institutions and the persons that are already exposed to the vulnerability. Let's bring awareness that also changes the social psyche of these inhabitants of these vulnerable areas. And thirdly, let's work towards reorienting their socialization. And it could be as simple things of, you don't have to use cash exchange to buy goods. You can actually use platforms such as an M-Pesa. And it was very important for us, as Safaricom also brought the offer that any transactions within 1,000 shillings were therefore not being charged any commission and so on. So let me leave it at that, Ofafa, for now. And thank you for inviting me in that question.
Thank you very much, George Osonga, for that. Very insightful points that you've given us. And even looking at how governments tell their citizens to stay at home, oblivious that some of these homes are actually not homes, they're houses that are the last places where you want to live. And already from, hello? Are you able to hear me?
Yes, Ofafa, you can proceed.
We're getting you.
Yes, and already from the charts, Mary Kimani is asking Jojo Songa, how do you keep social distances in low-income areas where a family shares one room or even one house? Somebody's already asking that from the chat. And I know you have a lot to tell such people, and from probably what you said, it's quite clear that we need to look at other aspects of making people safe than just telling them to go and stay at home and remain there. Professor Menya, you have done a lot of work on issues relating to urban sustainability, most of which revolve around healthy homes. What is your opinion on the role of housing as a mitigation measure against the spread of COVID-19, as far as behavioral urbanism is concerned?
Thank you very much, Ofafa. It's true. I mean, I got very interested in basically healthy architecture as part of my sustainability approach. And I just want to highlight from the start, some of the issues. We're taking this for granted, but like I highlighted, a lot of the cases that we have of sickness, of diseases, are actually diseases that are directly related to the environment. And most of that environment is actually the housing environment, especially when you're looking at children. In an introductory way, I just want to highlight that when you talk about environment, one is looking at environments that promote pathogens. And these are those disease causing agents. And then, of course, the other thing that we think about are what we call allergens. These are all sorts of chemicals that people may actually react to. And then, of course, there are other issues that may be less physical, like radiation and so on. And then, even more importantly, we have got psychological. We have got psychological issues relating to stress and so on. And that by the way, we've done studies even now for government of Kenya that basically indicated that the levels of stress and mental conditions worsened actually during the lockdown, particularly in informal areas. In fact, we did this for all informal areas in Kenya. Yeah, so when one is looking at healthy environment and health in terms of COVID, we have to look at it both from the quality of environment to the house itself, and then of course to the psychological level. And I just want to highlight again that, of course, when one is looking at the broader environment, I'll just give a few points for each of those. When one is looking at the broader environment, then of course one is looking at the infrastructure, one is looking at the services, one is looking at the quality of that environment in terms of cleanliness, in terms of sanitation, and so on and so forth. That environments that are clean, environments that are well serviced, are actually less likely to be home to pathogens that then would actually cause diseases. And that I was saying that incidentally, the National Hygiene Program and focus on sanitation in our low-income areas did actually make a contribution. And again, we've done a survey around that. that helped slow down the spread of COVID initially. Then, of course, we look at the house itself, the structure, and uh, uh, Professor Kimani, I think, has raised that issue on the chart. What are the issues that we need to look at when you're looking at the house? And you've said light is so important for the human being. And if you cannot get adequate lighting within the environment, you'll suffer both, from a physical perspective and also from a psychological perspective. Human beings actually need light, not just for vitamin D, but for health generally. We need ventilation. We have had cases where there's been again deaths associated with noxious gases. Our environments have a lot of gases that cause illness, from methane that come from breakdown of organic compounds, nitrous gases, phosphorus gases. We've had children dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. Yes, and what do you need to do with these gases? I mean, at the house level, what is important is that you have got adequate ventilation so that you reduce the concentration of these gases, because once the gases concentrate at a particular level, then the consequence directly is a whole lot of different diseases. And then, of course, it's also very important for us to ensure that these places are actually comfortable in terms of thermal comfort. We know sicknesses like pneumonia are very, very common in places that where temperatures swing from one extreme to another extreme. Yeah, so I want to ensure that within our housing, you've got actually reasonable temperature ranges that can then support good quality of life. And then, of course, we just need linked to this. We just need to ensure these places are cleanable. We need to ensure there's no damp, because that is very, very good for pathogens. We need to ensure that the materials that are used there are not a threat to health. For example, lead-based paints that people then inhale. Yes, and then of course there's the psychological aspect to it. In fact, which I'd actually alluded to in that way. You can get that framework and apply it to COVID. It applies, without any fear of contradiction. That yes, you can actually deal with COVID quite extensively, and I made that point in my opening remarks, by having very highly serviced, clean environments that are hygienic. You actually start slowing down. You start slowing down the spread of the pathogen. Within housing, you start ensuring that the basics are provided. These can be simple units, but you ensure they're very well lit, they're ventilated, the basic materials is actually fine. And then in terms of occupancy, you ensure that the densities are actually manageable. That of course makes a big contribution also in terms of slowing down the spread of COVID. In fact, in terms of breaking the pathways that the disease uses to perpetuate itself. And last but not least, and we're not really paying good enough attention to this, is actually the psychological aspect. And this is also very important in terms of the broader environment that we create, and these particular units that people are talking about. And again, I'll go back to Mary's point there on chat. If you're going to be locked up, to have a lockdown in one room without any lights and so on, that is no better than being in a maximum security prison. And that has serious consequences in terms of the state of mind. So we need to actually also look at these spaces. Well, as part of the support we're giving to government is to redesign the classroom so that the children don't feel that they're in prison. They feel connected to nature actually coming through. They feel that the place is healthy and so on. And so on and so forth with the external environment. And this is very, very key for the mental aspect of our health. Yeah, so Ofafa is at the core of the built environment, both in terms of the broader neighborhood quality and the quality of space, and the psychological aspects of space. All these are very, very critical in terms of responding to COVID, but also responding to diseases generally, some of them pandemics, but some of them just normal diseases that keep assaulting us from time to time, be it diarrhea, dysentery, pneumonia, and so on. And I'll tell you, you'll have to be surprised. So many of the diseases that we have are directly linked with the environment, and they're actually preventable. I mean, if you only planned well and we only built, as though humans matter, as though lives matter, as though children matter. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Omenya, for that. Jojo Songa, a key issue to resilient urban development that was identified during urban labs was that of uncoordinated efforts. CSUDP and other such agencies have undertaken a lot of work, as you have highlighted above. Do you work in partnership with other relevant stakeholders? Are there any challenges experienced in partnering with the, say, government entities to the execution of such projects?
Thank you, Ambrose. Indeed, Ambrose, I think a good starting point would be in any kind of situation where there is more than one party involved in an execution of a certain agenda, there is always a likelihood to be certain, if I could call it, emergence of tensions in court. So obviously, partnership with one, whether within civil society organizations or with government, normally would face certain challenges. But I think for me, what we normally take as an exercise, and having given you some of the perhaps partnerships that we had across during this COVID era with government, non-state agencies, private sector, and so on, what tends to be a common denominator there is the confidence that a partner brings in terms of their competence, their capabilities, their resource might, and so on and so forth. And of course, for government in terms of the policy environment and that. So confidence, this is often embodied, through that legitimate exercise of the mandate, either provided in law or coming onto you because of the position or status that that particular partner holds. Now, critically, and I think this is the important point is how that confidence is expressed. You could either be persuasive about how you express your confidence, or you can be abusive, and that to me is normally the break point. If you come in, for instance, and you feature yourself as the better party to your other partners, without necessarily saying, let's bring ourselves to this issue. It starts to, of course, either bring in bad blood or find other partnerships retracting into the peripheral distance. Now, having said that, working across with government, particularly in this pandemic era, was one of the most interesting experiences. And I think the key thing, as you know, is government is ultimately responsible for the populace, and coming down to say, look, let's break these boundaries and let's focus on the unit that is most important, and that is the people. For the first time around this pandemic, there has been a focus on the person, the people, so that a single life matters more than any policy dimensions and so on. So I think just getting back to the realization that, hey, we're in this for the people. So we don't want to lose one life. We don't want to lose half a life, if there's something like that. I think that to me was a very important driving factor, that certainly everything else that may be in terms of hierarchical interest or sort of jurisdictional interest and so on, this were all put aside, and we all, this all came together as one, and that to me is where really, if we have to address matters resilience and using partnership strategies and so on, we really have to go back to that very small point, that who are we planning for instance? Who are we designing for? who are we innovating for? It has to be that singular unit starting with that person, that individual. And therefore, respecting the fact that nobody is invisible, whether you are living with disabilities, whether you are elderly, whether your income is less than $1 a day, that total obliteration of invisibility and having people at the center, I think for me is a core thing. So it's a spirit that I would want to have. But of course, there are many lessons and experiences that have been picked along the line, some extremely useful, some may have been frustrating in the sense, and one of the key frustrating things normally is to arrive at a good accountability framework, and that often is a challenge. To what extent does everyone want to be absolutely and fully accountable to the letter? Thank you, Fafa.
Thank you very much, George, for that. I can't agree more. The biggest loss anywhere on earth is actually the loss of human life. And anything to compensate for it is highly welcome. And I really like that point. Professor Omenya, over time, built environment professionals have increasingly been blamed for the lack of adherence to basic urban planning and building guidelines, which are foundational principles for the resilient city. As the Africa representative in the global think tank, the International Building Quality Center, do you think professionals have taken a lame duck position and reduced to mere puppets of the political class?
Thanks, Fafa. I like the language towards the end there of professionals, being lame duck and being puppets of the politicians and the political system. The answer is yes, I think so. I actually think that professionals are not playing their role accordingly when it comes to this very, very important matter of safety, within our broader built environment. Let me just explain a little bit. The IBQC, the International Building Quality Center, basically is concerned about issues around the broader quality of our environment using standards and codes and regulations and so on. And with a bigger concern that despite this being there, we are seeing less and less resilient urban areas and I wonder, there seem to be some echoes. Yeah, so the International Building Center is keen to see that these standards, code, regulations around buildings, around planning, around housing are actually implemented. In many places in Africa here, of course, we have huge informal settlements, we have lack of regulation and so on. In Nairobi here, we are talking about, 70%, I'll need to verify that, but very, very high level of non-compliance and risky buildings. In everywhere where we're working, in Malawi last year, we had a huge destruction of rural housing and urban housing through floods. And we had we've had the same sort of problem. We work in Uganda. We've had same sort of problem with building vulnerability. I'm actually lead for Afghanistan, and the same problem. I mean, there are multiple levels of vulnerability, despite the fact that these countries have one or other, standards and regulations. Yes. So the key issue for us is why are these standards and regulations being adhered to, and what can we actually put on the table, to ensure that the built environment is improved. I think part of the problem is that the professional became a victim of the system, of the mold of the system that said, this is the regulation and we shall enforce it whether it works or it doesn't work. And we end up with dead letter sort of regulations. So one of the things that I've been trying to push for myself, and this has found very good traction within the World Bank, is to go back to the first principles. Why do we need regulations? Why do we need standards? Why do we need codes? At the core of it is actually about safety. And together with George, one of the things that we're asking is safety for who? It must actually be for the urban, disenfranchised urban majority. It must be for these excluded people who are actually the majority in urban areas, and they're the ones who are impacted most negatively. Whenever disaster happens, whenever all these other issues that we're talking about that hit urban areas happen, including the pandemic that we're actually talking about. Then, not to belabor the point, the question then becomes, how then do we approach regulation and standards for these segments of the population? Generally, you are not going to get somebody who does not have food on the table, who cannot even build, and tell them that they need to take their plans for approval in City Hall, and that they must pay this or that fees, or they must get this or that title. We need to totally shift our thinking to the problem itself. How do we make these areas resilient? And this actually means working together with these people. It means spending less time regulating to providing guidelines. In Malawi, we provided something we are calling safer housing guidelines. In fact, that is a piece of work that started with Aak-Unhabitat, and we've continued, and we've actually integrated that in the standards. In Afghanistan, we are looking at traditional housing and vernacular housing, and how they've been building this over years, and seeing how we can actually work with them so that the quality can actually be improved. We are looking at how in Jamaica, communities have been able to respond to hurricane across time, and the technologies have been using, and starting to see how they can be supported to do that. Secondly, we ask who is building and what skills do they actually have. And again, the idea is to skill people so that those who are putting up these particular buildings have got some particular skills that guarantee a particular quality of construction. The many things I can go on and on about this. The issue again is around the institutions. So what institution are you going to use in a tribal area in Malawi that has never had a planner from the time Christ was born? They don't even know whom that is. They've never had an engineer. So the idea again is that you work with the people that you find there. It is that traditional chief. And then you start asking yourself, what sort of basic capacities would this person need to be able to enforce minimum standards within the jurisdiction? And we are shifting the discourse from issues of compliance to and issues of policing to actually enabling citizens, live basically live in more resilient settlements. And some of these things can be done incrementally. So people can improve their houses over time. Some of these things can be done through capacity building of the local builders. Some of these can be done through existing institutions and so on, because it's a fact. You can take that to the bank. Our current building standards, codes, and so on, and the way they've been designed is part of the problem. It is actually what is making our countries and our settlements less resilient. It is what is making you and I as professionals irrelevant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Menya. I like the zeal with which you finished that. I really like that zeal.
Papa, can I add? Papa, can I just add to that?
Please do, Robbie.
Okay, great, thank you. I just want to pick up on what Professor was saying, and I think one of the things is that when we talk about, I think what I was mentioning earlier in terms of how we've come to a point and we stop, we pull back, if you will. That has consequences. So I wasn't just raising that point just an example earlier. It has consequences when we don't bring our professional expertise to everyday people's lives. And it really has real consequences. I'd even ask everyone that's here with us today, the 83 of us, it's a great turnout so far. How many of us have attended our county development, budgeting meetings and engagement forums? I know this is in a webinar format, so we can't see people's hands being raised and so forth, but how many of us are taking our expertise to our county development and budgeting processes? We have the expertise, we have the knowledge like no one else has. And then when we pull back and don't participate in those structures, it leaves it and we get what we get, if you will. It's kind of just one of the consequences when we pull back and we're paid. You see, politics and the whole structure of politics, and let's not be shy about it. Planning let's not be shy about it. What we are doing here, what our profession is, it is political in nature, because planning and what we're asking people to do is to move resources, is to redistribute power, is to give access to others. That is political by its nature. And when we don't engage in it in that way, that's when we leave we leave cleavage, we leave space for breakdown, we leave space for these things that we're saying that are so important. And then as Prof talked about, if you will, and how communities, how do we shift and come from the ivory tower and the elite nature of our profession, and shift what already is happening on the ground in communities and in indigenous areas? How do we listen to what they're doing, and then we adapt to what is already happening on the ground? How do we do that more so? And one of the things that, I wanted to just offer and to just say, are we willing to create community planning educational centers, if you will, that we are educating people and citizens on what this whole structure is and how they can utilize these processes for themselves and for their full advantage? And it's not just for some people to participate, but this is something all of us can have some kind of baseline understanding and baseline entry points, so that we can build that resilience, not from only our vantage point and viewpoint, but that it comes from the ground up and we just kind of, facilitate it. That's what I just wanted to add.
Thank you very much, Robin. To add on the zeal that Professor Omenya winded up his previous comments on, actually there was a call during the previous annual convention of AAK from one of the senators, that is Senator Sylvia Kasanga, that professionals actually need to join politics and politicians. The way it is we are professionals, they are politicians, and they're that side, we are this side. And actually, that's a very big failure. I agree with you, Robin, that we actually need to go to them, challenge them, and show them how we can work and actually shift the way things have been working, so that we work forward. Thank you very much, Robin, for that. Robin, you co-authored a book titled Building in Kenya, where you give expert advice on the building process in Kenya. During yesterday's session, the use of locally available materials was identified as a possible solution to the housing situation in Kenya as far as realization of the urban resilience is concerned. What is your thoughts on this consideration that the country's building code is yet to incorporate such local methods of building construction?
Okay. Well, I think this is something that is long overdue. I think, as Professor Omenya says, he's working on those codes, and many others probably here that are on this in this webinar. It is. Somebody's even asking Prof if you can give a review on those codes, if you will, and where it stands. But I think that, again, it's all, if you will, inside of the political realm. It is critical that many of these codes, it's not just the building codes, but it's several other policies inside of that affect our profession that are out of date, and that do need to be brought into the current context in which our sector is functioning and is operating. And so then someone asked a moment ago in terms of the economic incentives, if you will, in terms of making these changes. And so we know that local materials, local thinking, local ways of doing business will always bring inside of the resilience. We know that communities have been producing, and they have been building, and they've been using sources for hundreds of years. And so when we are putting restrictions or barriers into that indigenous use and indigenous thinking, it forces us to go outside and use those that aren't easily found or easily absorbed, and it's just not sustainable. It is not sustainable, and in so many other ways. One of the things, kind of a fear that we're starting to see is us reverting back to, even though we're here on a webinar, will we revert to us having to fly to events? Or will we revert to heavy traffic? If we don't put in some of these measures now, when we have a chance to put in some of the measures that we know are going to help us environmentally, if we don't put those in now, we will automatically, if you will, revert back to our default way of doing business. And that's in the building, that's in the use of materials. And so although that we might be struggling to get some materials from outside in at the moment, and maybe but we need to kind of put a ring fence on what are we saying are the materials that we want people to use. If they're accessible or not accessible, we need to guide people to the types of development that we think are most beneficial.
Thank you very much for that. And I also like your zeal on how you really call on people to act. George, poverty is arguably the most ambiguous and noxious risk factor for population health. Its effects straddle acute the chronic conditions, accumulate over the life course, and they are transmitted across generations. And this can be manifested during the Ebola and COVID-19. Do you believe built environment professionals have a role in solving the problems of urban resilience?
Thank you, Ofafa. And I want to make this very brief. And actually, Robin has done the work for me. She made some three key statements that I want to use in this nature. Build professionals to be better listeners and to adapt, and not be on the ivory tower and emerging answers for those particular poor communities. Because within that poverty, there is some sense of what you call resilience that one needs to pluck out, one needs to figure out what it is and then shape it using the professional eye for it to be more beneficial. The second that she mentioned that I also want to pick up in my summation is be part of the conversation. These communities, poverty is not a disease. So we that work with these poor people, you actually see children and you look at their faces despite the circumstances they're living in, and yet there's joy, there's happiness, they're bubbly. And I think we need to be part of that conversation at that level, whether they're struggling to make their plans, or whether we want to give them tools to perhaps approach it from a social planning perspective to capture the ideas. I think this we need to do. Lastly, we need to be supportive of innovations. And we just need to say, where is it coming from? Which angle? How do we make this become more visible, become more acceptable, meet the norms and standards and so on? Because those people are struggling to cope. And every day, however small it is, they are innovating in one way or the other. So I think those to me would be the three contexts that I would want to express in that sense. Thank you, Ofafa.
Ofafa, you're on mute. Ofafa, you're on mute.
Sorry about that, and thanks for letting me know. I hope I didn't talk a lot when I was on mute. I was just appreciating George Songa, yourself, that is Robin Emerson, and Professor Menya, for joining us in this panel discussion. What you've told us is actually quite rich in moving forward. We are almost coming to the end of this panel discussion. And before I give you opportunities to do parting shots very shortly, I'd like to look at the Q&A so that you can respond also very quickly. I'd like to take a few questions from the floor. And there is one from Mary Kimani. Probably George, you could answer this. How do you deconstruct the emerging notion, especially in low-income areas, that COVID-19 does not exist, but numbers are manipulated for government to access WHO funding?
Ofafa, very quickly, unfortunately, we are already at the community spread level. So it's gotten much closer to us, and I don't think there's any new announcement wants to make. Every other person has a tentacle or a relation or a friend or someone who they now realize has happened. Two, our health systems are overloaded, and it is obvious to everyone that, hey, this is no longer just what we thought was the statistics of our CS, but this is really come down home. So unfortunate as it is, I think it has come to that level where, as the CS said, the responsibility is up to us, and it is us to act to make sure we stay alive. So essentially, I wouldn't think there's much more convincing that may be required than just to actually look at the scenarios as they manifest at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, and I agree with that. Actually, now, if you're not infected, you are definitely affected in one way or the other. Professor Menya, probably this one is from you. It's coming from George Onyango. Has someone done costing for the urban poor on cost of these COVID-19 requirements? Cost of water, soap, mask, sanitizing environment. That's the bottom line. I think this is more of a comment than a question, but probably you can talk about it. Professor Menya.
Yes, thank you, Fafa, for that. Incidentally, for us in Kenya, this is a time that this thinking is going on as part of the support we're giving to government funded by FCDO. I think people knew it more as DFID, but anyway, the British government. Part of what we've done is to look at what was needed in these informal areas in Kenya, basically all over the country, and what was actually supplied. And we are putting figures to those amongst many other things. This is to help actually rationalize government response, continued response to the pandemic. But currently, this is an ongoing piece of work. In fact, we've taken a brief break. We're assuming in about 2 weeks. And I think towards the end of the year, we're going to have very, very elaborate information that is actually necessary. But in fact, you know, there's been a lot of support from government relating to water supply, relating to sanitation, relating to Kazi Mtaani, that has been doing a bit of cleaning up in these different areas. Development partners have also been doing their bit. Counties have been doing their bit. NGOs, Shofco has been a great example around. But again, like Prof. Nyango is saying, most of these have been happening in a haphazard way, so that the need has not been quantified, and even what was supplied has not been quantified. And we're doing that now. And hopefully with that, then we can say, fine, in terms of response, this is actually what is needed, or maybe what was supplied was adequate and so on. Yes, so it's currently that we're doing that audit. And I know this will be shared once the piece of work is finished. Like I said, this piece of work is funded by the UK government, and is being run by the State Department of Housing and Urban Development. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that, and all the best in that assignment. Just before you go, I'd like to give you the first opportunity to give a parting shot as you're winding up. Professor.
Yes, I think Robin and George, you know, it seems like we're speaking from the same mind. At the end of the day, these things just comes to the human being, and facilitating the human being, supporting the human being to be a lot more resilient in the city. And whether you look at it from the housing perspective that we've spoken to, it's just about the human, and how are you caring for this human in all his, with all his needs, from social to actual practical needs. When it comes to issues of standards that we've actually spoken about, it is not imposing, policing this human, but actually finding out the struggles of this human being, the resilient systems that these people have actually developed. We've seen amazing innovation during COVID, and then asking, how can we work with this to ensure that you know, the fundamental principles that guarantee safety and health and so on is actually done, and then this way we'll actually be building resilience. However, if we choose the other way around, of a top-down approach to imposing measures, including policing, they will fail. They will definitely fail. But if you work with people, with what they have, and we grow that, then definitely we'll incrementally build a stronger and more resilient cities and towns. that can, that can actually resist shocks and even deal with these issues like pandemics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robin Emerson, I have the pleasure to welcome you to give you closing remarks and potential. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. As an urban planner, I see us in the built environment having such a responsibility on people's lives. And I take our role, or I take myself as an urban planner to be someone that influences the human being's experience of life in every way possible. And one of the personal commitments that I have and made for myself in the work that I do is that my commitment is to create a world that works for everyone with no one being left out. To create a world for everyone with no one being left out. And that challenges me every morning, every day that I wake up and I think about, am I tired? Do I want to do this? Do I want to think about that? It shores me up on the work that I'm here to do. It shores me up. And so I'm inviting all of us to, look, what's our resolution, if you will, as in this built environment, built professionals. And so what's our resolution and how are we playing a role for that? And I like that multi-hazard, when I reread that, do you know how many hazards that could be? That we're not just talking COVID, we're not just talking flood. We talked about the emotional hazards, the emotional traumas. We're talking about the financial trauma. We're talking multi-hazards. When I think about building a resilient city that can respond to multi-hazards, that makes me contort my thinking. It makes me contort my concept of who people are, what their capacity is, and what we can build as cities that can respond to that. So urban resilience, it then requires many essential principles and characteristics. So I'm just going to say, just remind us all as we're going out. For robustness, are we being robust? Stability, diversity, redundancy. Are we being flexible? Are we being resourceful? How are we coordinating the capacity of one another? All right. What's our modularity? What are the different modules we're coming up with that we can throw out? Just throw them out on the, spaghetti against the wall, and let's not stop coming up with innovations. What's our foresighting capacity, right? So we can think far ahead on different scenarios about what could happen. And are we playing those out? And are we tapping into each other's expertise and knowledge? How are we adapting? And then this whole urban system can be as refined and as perfected here in Kenya and be a model for other communities across Africa.
Thank you very much, Robin, for that. George Osonga, your partnership, please.
Thank you, Fafa, and thank you, panelists. I think as Prof said and Robin has said, there's been quite some convergence in thoughts, despite us taking it from different angles. But key for me is just a simple word. Let's build with and not build for. And for me, the key thing there is that unit or person of interest for whatever we're building has to be in that conversation, has to be in contact with what is being designed, and has to influence to some extent what we want to finally deliver. And lastly, I think let's combat this exclusivity that we see, or the exclusion that we see in urban areas, with the same resolve that we have combated the COVID-19 pandemic. That is being together, crossing professional boundaries and saying there's a collective front to how we want to make our vulnerable in the urban society perhaps more included into the economics, the social, and other physical attributes of the urban landscape. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for that. Professor Alfredo Menya, Robin Emerson, and again, George Osonga, I really, really appreciate your time to come and join me in this panel to educate us on what is lacking and what should be done moving forward. We have come to the end of this discussion, and now I'll go back to Juliet Ritter. Yes, I've seen her. I'll go back to Juliet Ritter, who is the convener, to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambrose. It's been a very engaging session, very good insights. I would ask our audience to continue typing in their questions on the chat box. We'll have the Q&A after the second session that we're going to have. And we are going to invite a few of you just to ask your questions on the floor. In the meantime, allow me to welcome Mark Ojal, who's from the UN Habitat. He'll be the moderator for the second session. So Mark, over to you. Mark, are you with us?
Yes. Can you see me?
Yes, yes, and we can hear you well. So I'll leave it to you now to lead us to the second session.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, everybody, and really excited to be here with you all with a very amazing panel. I would say diverse topic, and as Robin said, there are lots of hazards that we have that we need to look into. Just to sort of set the agenda for this conversation, and giving a bit of background to this, disaster risks, and not just disasters, but everyday risks, represent one of the most important or defining development challenges of our time, if you will. From droughts that we are seeing in the countrysides to water crisis. By the way, we have water stress in Nairobi. We need to know that. Cape Town was facing day zero last year, 2018 and last year. And it's a silent problem in Nairobi that we don't talk about every day. To such things as fires, which we know of, but then to other silent killers like air quality and air quality levels, which are low in pollution. But then again, there is an opportunity. We know that 60% of cities that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. At the same time, we know that infrastructure that will exist by then, or at least 75% of the infrastructure that will exist by 2030, again, is yet to be built. This represents an opportunity for us to rethink the city. And COVID has come at a very opportune time when we are just embarking on the decade of action, to rethink the city and to remind us of the importance of planning cities, taking planning seriously, integrating risk-reducing infrastructure and services into planning, rethinking urban governance, which is so important, and putting communities at the core of planning processes. At this point, I would like to invite Dr. Joe Mulligan of the KDI. Joe is a civil engineer who works with the KDI as an associate director. He's passionate about joint application of science and local knowledge to develop responsive and sustainable projects, as evident in the KDI projects across the world, not just in Nairobi. He oversees all KDI Kenya's operations and co-directs what happens elsewhere within KDI. He has over 10 years of professional experience in sustainable infrastructure development, and has worked on the delivery of water, wastewater, and drainage systems, and participatory planning and design. He has a rich experience in community-led urban development. He's worked in various countries in the world, including China, Nigeria, Haiti, Ghana, Malaysia, among others. He holds a PhD in strategies for sustainable development from KTH, Royal Institute of Technology. Welcome, Joe.
Mark, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks to the AAK and UN Habitat for hosting this important discussion. I'm really, really happy to be here today, following on from and now joined by esteemed colleagues who are really shaping and leading the conversation about our future cities in Kenya and wider afield. Mark and the AAK team had asked me to talk about urban flooding in particular and how it relates to the issues of resilience in Nairobi and also in other cities. And so I wanted to share with you all some slides and some images from our work at KDI. So let me share my screen. 1 second. Mark, are you seeing my screen clearly here?
Yes. Yes.
Wonderful. Great. Okay, so urban flooding, the multi-hazard city and resilience. First of all, I'll just say a little bit about KDI and how we are coming to these questions of urban flooding. The background of the organization is that we're a non-profit design and community development organization that partners with under-resourced communities, specifically with a mission that's really around equity in the built environment. And we aim to accomplish this mission through advocacy, research, planning, and built works. And as Mark has mentioned, we're working across different geographies in Southern California, in Sweden, where I myself am based, and also in Nairobi, in Kenya. And we're a team across those offices of around 50 architects, landscape architects, urban planners, engineers, and a significant proportion of our team are community development professionals. And so we try and bring together those different disciplines on these questions of equity. And I think that's actually at the core of how AAK has been approaching multidisciplinary.
Joe?
Hey, Mark.
Yeah, I think we lost the slides.
Okay, let me try and share again. Great. So and now as I start to talk about urban flooding more particularly, I'll just mention what our firm's name, which is Kunkui Design Initiative, KDI. The Kunkui is a Thai word which means to know intimately, and that's really where we've been starting and going on with this work, is working very closely with residents and communities in the different geographies that we work in. And I think it talks to what George Wasonga was saying in the previous session about building on local knowledge and local practices of resilience. Wonderful. So I'll talk a little bit more about our work on urban flooding. And I want to say that I was due to speak today alongside one of my colleagues from Nairobi, who's been doing a lot of this work. And he's currently on site with 3 projects which are under construction on flood adaptation and nature-based solutions to water management. So he was drawn to the field today to site to keep an eye on some of those projects. So he sends his apologies, and I'm presenting this work on behalf of all of us really, and in particular our office in Nairobi. Our work on urban flooding, it didn't come from the perspective of of engineering or of hydrology. It actually came from the perspective of residents. And I'll mention a little bit about how we really started to dig into this question. As I think has been touched on in the sessions earlier and previously in the conversations over the last couple of days, we've talked about the significance and the importance of residents of the city who are living in lower income neighborhoods, often in informal conditions. And as we know, there's a confluence of natural drainage paths, rivers, and some of these lower income areas. And so this question of the confluence of urbanization and climate change really comes into focus when we're talking about neighborhoods such as Kibera, where we've been working since 2006. And the pace of urbanization and the nature of urbanization which we're experiencing is so radically different from anything that's being experienced elsewhere in the world. And so the solutions that are required need to come from an urban perspective, which is of and from the cities which are experiencing these changes. And so, you know, the case of Nairobi is of particular interest because of the rapid urbanization, but also because of some of the historical planning practices going back to the colonial period, which have created a condition essentially of environmental injustice and of socioeconomic stratification, which has this additional layer of rivers, topography, and drainage, which is where, as a civil engineer, I tend to come in. As I mentioned, we've been working in Kibera since 2006, and it's obviously, as many of you will know, it's a dense, highly dense neighborhood with limited open and green space, issues of solid waste management, and the waterways and the watercourses, the Gong River of Kibera, are often used as a conveyance for solid waste and organic waste as well, which is an issue for the settlement and for residents in Kibera, but also for residents of the wider Nairobi downstream. I wanted to mention also some of the impacts, specific impacts of COVID in this period. We've been building throughout the period, but also talking to residents about issues ranging from flooding, but also to the impacts of COVID. And just in this period, before and after the COVID onset of COVID and the regulations, we've seen a huge drop-off of almost 50% in household income. So this is talking to almost 1,500 residents from 6 groups across Kibera before and now during the COVID pandemic. So I'm just highlighting here the socio-economic impact of this pandemic and the restrictions as well. And I think we can all feel some of those impacts in the wider city also. So in these challenging environmental conditions, the approach that we've taken from the beginning is to work on a model of productive public space, physical remediation at the local scale of some of these waste spots and unsafe spots, and layering of social and economic programming on top of them. And I have to give a shout out here to our co-founder, Alpha Adea, who is, as many of you know, a renowned landscape architect, leader in urban thinking, and co-founder of KDI. And he was the one, along with the other co-founders, who got us working on this model in Kibera in 2006. working very closely with residents to co-develop these sites, and taking spaces like this one just upstream of Nairobi Dam in Silanga, which was a waste space and flooded space, and developing low-cost, high-impact public space solutions. This is the same area in Silanga. Further west in Gatokera village, also on the Gong River. This is a site that we've been working on since 2012. And this is the space as it is quite recently, with a sanitation block, multi-purpose hall, laundry pad, and pedestrian bridge delivered in partnership with Nairobi City County, crossing the Gong River to the Langata site. And just a final project in Kibera. This is a site of the Anwar School in Lindi Village before development, and this is the current school, which we have developed over the last several years in partnership with AAK, amongst others. So, bringing this back to flooding now, what have these public spaces got to do with flooding? Well, the fact is that our approach has been to start with residents and ask what their priorities are, for development of these spaces. And lots of different things have come up, as you've seen, but the one consistent thing that has come up has been the issue of flooding. Partly because the sites are located alongside the rivers, but not all of them are. This flooding issue is consistent throughout. And it connects to not just issues of the riparian or riverine flooding, but also to localized flooding, solid waste management throughout the neighborhood and in the wider city as well. So it really became something that we had to tackle. And we realized that, of course, this isn't something that can be addressed at the local scale by small projects. It's a transboundary issue. It's an ecological issue. It requires a watershed level approach and thinking. And so we started to step back and start and work with flooding at a larger scale, including working with engineering firms such as Bureau Hapod Engineering, and latterly with the Technical University of Kenya to actually produce detailed flood extents mapping, hazard mapping for Kibera riverways, but also the drainage pathways of the settlement as well. I'll be going on about one hazard here, Mark, but as you know better than anyone, this is a multi-hazard question, and it's actually the linkages between hazards which add up to this kind of systemic issue of risk for residents. And flooding is catastrophic at times in Kibera, but it's more the everyday challenges that people face and the overlaps with the other risks as well. Whether it's simple slips or it's linkages to issues like public health and waterborne disease. So there's a cascading of impacts which are connected to this, on the surface, simple issue of drainage. And I want to highlight some of our data that kind of brings this home. This is a map of flood extents on the Gong River. And this is household level data from 1,000 households before and after the rainy season, which captures incidences of household flooding. And what you see is that, yes, there are high incidences of household flooding along the riverine areas, but also in these higher up areas here up on the road in Lindi, you're actually seeing a high prevalence of flooding as well, as I said earlier, driven by local drainage issues and solid waste. And the real impact there is that even though structures aren't being washed away, you're experiencing, families are experiencing high levels of waterborne disease, almost twice the national urban average in Kenya. So from a public health perspective, which becomes even more important in this time of COVID, you can see what the impacts of poor drainage are. And when we actually look at flood extents as compared to the riparian buffer zone as stipulated in the Water Act, you can see there's quite a big difference actually because of the morphology of the river. And so we started to think of different planning tools to address housing in the riparian zone and how public space and infrastructure could actually be developed in practice in some of these contested areas. And what we started to do was to kind of take these tools back to residents, professional disciplinary tools from engineering, from planning, of site-specific flood risk assessment, producing a buffer zone to the river, making sure that there was no inappropriate development within that buffer zone, but also making space for residents to understand why that buffer zone needed to be in place, and a process of co-locating and deciding on public space facilities in the space that was safe and available to develop. So this goes back to the conversation earlier about really taking our disciplinary tools and applying them in practice, and applying them to the needs of the people most affected by these environmental hazards. And you know, the flood extents model, for example, has many different applications, as any planner and engineer will know. One important one is in setting, for example, the bridge level of this pedestrian bridge, which links Langata and Kibera. You can see it's set at a much higher level than the pre-existing bridge. And I think this is an example of where you're bringing together modeling tools, you're bringing together the best of engineering and fabrication in Kenya. This is a bridge that was designed with Arab East Africa and constructed by Steel Structures, with a community engagement process managed by KDI. It's a small project in some ways, but in other ways, it's about an infrastructure which links different parts of the city and creates access and public rights of way, and starts a conversation about how we think of the city as a joined up entity. And a couple of other flood related interventions I'll mention. You know, this issue of local drainage is also a major one to tackle. There's so much that can be done at the local scale to reduce the imperviousness of surfaces, to collect water where it falls, to store water, and to reduce some of these real, really prevalent challenges that people are facing in the everyday. In this project, which is in Makina village of Kibera, where my colleagues are on site today, we've used, beneath the landscape plaza here, we've used what's actually soda crates to build a structured storage space, structurally tested, and a huge volume which takes water from the roof, from the plaza, and stores it underground, allows it to infiltrate, rather than tipping it directly into the adjacent drainage channels, where many people are using, you know, those drainage channels essentially as a public access way in public space. So this is about the small things we can do at the local scale to reduce urban flooding. And as we've worked over the last 10 plus years, trying out some of these different nature-based solutions, blue infrastructure systems, concrete channels, and when we've needed to, because sometimes you need to move water away from places where people are inhabiting, we started to build up a portfolio of different hybrid solutions, and started to test and evaluate them from a perspective of cost, from technical performance, and from the perspective of residents. How do residents feel about drainage systems which use nature and planting, for example? So shortly wrapping up, Mark, and just as I finalize this presentation, I'll make mention of some of the work that we're trying to now do to lift these very localized experiences and connect them to questions of development and infrastructure at the larger scale. We've looked a lot at what some of the limitations are for action by individuals, what people do at the local scale to manage flooding, and also some of the barriers for the larger scale public policy measures that the municipality and others have been working on, and really building a case for a public space and an infrastructure-led approach to upgrading, which tackles some of these multiple hazards, including flooding, and starts to build upon a social network, first of all, to think about upgrading at the larger scale. And flood modeling is actually a tool in that process. There's if you're more into the process questions, there's a paper that we produced with colleagues in Nairobi, including at the Technical University of Kenya, on flood modeling for negotiation and planning, which might be of interest to some. But the next step for us is really more practical, and I'm really pleased today to be able to announce a new project, which is a partnership between KDI, the Architectural Association of Kenya, AAK, Arab East Africa, and University College London, as well as Akiba Mashinani Trust, the legal arm of the Kenyan Federation of Slum Dwellers, which is to produce in the next coming year an integrated and inclusive infrastructure framework for upgrading in informal settlements, working alongside partners at the county and NMS to really address what integrated infrastructure looks like in Kibera, but also in other informal settlements, including Mafare, and looking back at the experiences of Makuru and understanding the impacts of that important project, the special planning area, on risk, on hazard, on social and economic goals as well. So that's very exciting, and we're looking forward to partnering with AAK on that project. I think the task force on urban flooding is the leader of AAK's contribution, and we very much look forward to working with George Arabu and others on this project. Mark, thanks so much for the chance to share some of this work. I hope that was useful and interesting to the conversation, and I really look forward to discussing with you and our esteemed colleagues on this panel.
Thank you so much, Joe, for a very insightful presentation on various things that touch on risk planning and, or rather risk-informed planning, and also bringing in the element of hard and soft interventions when it comes to rethinking the city. I was also really impressed by some of the points that you raised around what inappropriate development looks like and the role of the community in negotiating development. And I think oftentimes we do not really, we do not emphasize the role of the community in negotiated development, in rethinking the city. And I think KDI has done an excellent job in bringing community voices into urban development decision-making. At this point, I would like to then introduce our panelists, building on the agenda set by Joe very clearly. Our first panelist is John Paul Obonyo. John Paul is a program officer with Haki Yetu, one of the civil societies operating at the coast. And then we have Planner Mwenda Riungi, the Deputy Director of Physical Planning from Tana River County. And now maybe I could give each of them just a few minutes to introduce themselves. We could start with you, Mwenda. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you are doing in Tana River County, and looking particularly at this topic that you are discussing today. Tell us a little bit more of some of the actions that you are taking as a county.
Thank you so much, Mark. As you've done the introductions, my name's Mwenda Ryungu, the Deputy Director in charge of Physical Planning in Tana River County. I joined Tana River last year in 2019. And let me say that this has come, the topic of discussion has come in very handy at this particular time when we are talking about the building multi-hazard resilient cities. As we all know, Tana River is, let me call it a unique county where we have multifaceted disasters. At one time, we are fighting flooding. At another time, we are fighting droughts. And both of them bring quite a number of issues concerning planning of our urban areas. We, as we all know, Tana River as two distinct kind of communities, where we have the agrarian, agro-based community, and we have a pastoralist community. This aspect, in terms of the two major disasters we have now the pandemic we have, COVID-19, brings into issue two issues in planning our cities. One, we have the issue of resource conflict, because the major resource we have is the river itself. The county is quite large, but the river is one basic resource that we are finding quite tough to manage these two communities. So in this aspect, bearing in those the aspects that we are looking at how do we now tackle this to reduce conflict, and to utilize the resource that we have and our urban centers. We have started a project called the Eco Village or cluster concept, where we are getting to try and have the communities that are affected by floods and settle at higher grounds, because we are having a cyclic kind of losses, infrastructure loss, and human life. You find, like, for instance, in the last 2 years, if we put into cost what has been put into managing those disasters, it's close to 2 billion every year. Every year, Kenya shillings 2 billion is spent. So when you look at that, you find that it's not actually sustainable. So we are coming up with that, what we are calling the cluster program, which is community-based. The community, even the speakers in the earlier session have been speaking that you have to do this thing with the people for you to have sustainable cities and urban areas. Now, this is being done through incentives of provision of infrastructure, that is both social and physical. We have partnerships with the partners, and it's good that I've had Joe from KDI. That's a good initiative. I would like, I would also like to get more into that as well, as we plan our towns here in Tana River. Then we have now the cluster program. The program is now focused on 3 major pillars: housing, food security, and conservation. We realize that a lot of water a lot of flooding that comes to Tana River is actually not floods from Tana River, but from the the upstream. That is both the main river and what we call the seasonal rivers. Now, once we have tackled the people who are living along the river and who flooding is perennial, we have now the pastoralists. When now the drought comes, remember the delta is very rich. The Tana Delta, that's the south of the county. The pastoralists have to come down with all their flock down to Tana River. That's causing a lot of conflict between the farmers and the pastoralists. So now the process of in the process of our intervention, we are looking at having these clusters also based on what we can call damming of the seasonal rivers, such that water is harvested upstream in the seasonal rivers. And this will ensure that we have pasture throughout in the upper zones. This will reduce conflict within between our people and also provide for sustainable kind of livelihood. To add on that, maybe to sort of add my brief introduction is that the communities need a lot of awareness, that is one. And two, in this process, it needs a mind change. I mean, psychologically, definitely people have a way of life. You know, you may provide this, but you find that as much as you are providing these kind of interventions, there are those people whose mindset is, I have to be next to the river. Whether there is pasture or not, I have to go down to the delta with my livestock. So there is that kind of mind change that we have to grapple with as we do our multi-hazard, the resilient cities we're having. But one thing is, it is real, and maybe what we have, I talked in a group we were in yesterday. We want to come out from what I call disaster tourism. Disaster tourism is people coming to see the disasters we have, but no intervention. We are only putting cosmetic interventions and then leave the people for us to wait for another year and take photos of how this river is sweeping people, how drought is affecting us, instead of coming up with a sustainable interventions. Maybe that would be my introductory part for Tana River, but this is entirely very rich, this discussion, and I think AK and UN-Habitat should take it to another level as we share these experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mwenda, and really you touched on lots of issues. One of them is delta planning and looking at the whole corridor. Pointing out clearly that the kind of floods that affects Tana River County does not necessarily come from Tana River, but is something that is determined upstream from Garissa coming down up from Masinga into Garissa, then down to Tana River. And I think it's something that we need to start thinking about, in terms of corridor development and corridor planning, looking at urban planning and design with water. How do we think the future? At this point, I would like to bring in John Paul Obonyo, who has been working largely with civil society organizations and grassroots initiatives at the coast, to tell us a little bit about himself, tell us a little bit about Haki Yetu, and what they are doing to support vulnerable communities in the coast region. John Paul, see us.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Mwenda, it's long since we met. It's good to see you again. And thanks to Joe for the presentation. I'm Obonyo John Paul from Haki Yetu organization. Haki Yetu is registered as a charitable trust under the laws of Kenya, because you need to be compliant in this country, otherwise they'll come for you. Established back in 2008 to give a voice and representation to the vulnerable persons and communities in Kenya and the coast region in particular. We operate in 4 counties, that is Mombasa, Kilifi, Kwale, and Taita Taveta. That's our area of coverage. How we implement our work, we implement our interventions in 4 thematic areas. That is, 1 is on land and housing, 2, governance and accountability, 3, cohesion and transformation, and lastly, issues of gender and law. Gender and law is very critical because this is where we have the child protection policy. Our children have to be safe either way, because in all that we do, we involve families. So children are at the center of all these. And why do I bring this? Because on the issue of the programs that we implement, we find that we deal with very vulnerable families at the end of the day. We are based, initially we were based back in the informal settlements in Bangladesh. I know many people have heard about Bangladesh in Mombasa, and we even have Bangladesh because we were devolved long time ago, even before Mark could think of devolution. But currently we actually have satellite offices at the center of the town at Star of the Sea. We have an office in Lungalunga. We have an office in Kilifi County, that is in Malindi. It's only in Taveta where we're still trying to be able to find a probable venue that we can actually operate in. But we have issues. More so in today's issues, I'm really touched by Joe's presentation when he mentioned on the issue of flooding and the issue of water. You know, Mombasa County, first we'll ask Mwenda, come back to Mombasa. We don't have a planner in Mombasa, apparently. That's the biggest hiccup that we do in Mombasa. We have no planner. And we see having no planner, I mean, that's a human resource issue that we need to think of. How best can we lobby for that? But the key issue is in relation to today's subject is, what do we do as Aak-Unhabitat? Aak-Unhabitat convenes the land, what we call the coast land and state actors. These are civil society organizations who've come together to address the issue of land and housing, the issue of environment, the issue of utilities. And when this happens, I mean, we're looking at the right to city, but when all these are in place, how best do we address all these concerns? We are all spread, in the 6 sub-counties. And you know, Mombasa has got 72 informal settlements. So how do we engage the issue of informal settlements into urban planning? Number one, there are key issues that I don't know whether to share them now, but what do we look at when talking about right to city in Mombasa County? And this will bring the discussion further in terms of what exactly do we look at when talking about right to city? There are key components. But for Aak-Unhabitat, what we do, first, apart from hosting the land network, one, we actually monitor the issue of implementation of plans in Mombasa County. Having said this, that we have 17 informal settlements, 61% of the residents in Mombasa actually reside in informal settlements. So what does it tell you? That when you're doing planning, you must incorporate and think of the informal settlers into our engagements. That is a priority that we must actually think of. Number two, the issue of mindset. I know in Mombasa County, historically, people talk about marginalization, but what do we do? As social actors, we can't just sit and wait for the government to implement. We must come up with unique ideas and be creative enough to be able to come up with those ideas that actually require resource allocation and how can they be part of the planning. One key thing when you're talking about right to city, we know during the COVID-19 pandemic, we had the issue of forced evictions in this country. Mombasa was affected, and I mean, the impact of these forced evictions actually hampered the issue of how best do we engage with the government. We saw that private developers, we were told to stay at home, but the same government came and actually moved people out of their homes. So how best do you address the issue of this right? This right is actually relative. So we need to think of it, how best do we come up with the right to city, but actually the government is giving you the one hand and taking it away also. That's a critical component. But at Aak-Unhabitat, there are 3 key things that we do with these communities. Number one, the issue of the fisheries, the fish landing sites. We had a campaign on nowhere to land. We have 14 gazetted landing sites, but in total there are about 52. Those who love coming to Mombasa, most of the hotels are built on landing sites. Kindly desist from visiting such, because we need to think of the mindset also from a different perspective. But this nowhere to land, we talk about the beach management units. Who thinks about the fishery sector? Is it an area in the agriculture sector that we need to think of critically as actors in this country? How best do we talk about food security when all the landing sites are in private hands? How best do we talk about food security when all the BMUs were taken away by the SGR? How best do we talk about food security when some of the BMUs are actually being affected by private developers and Ngokundu bypass in the name of urban planning and development? These are critical concerns that we also need to think of. The fisher folk are actually a critical sector. They're not a marginalized group that we need to think of them in a different way. Secondly, we have come up with a resettlement option plan with Kenya Power and Kenya Railways. Kenya Power have been more responsive, that we've seen quite a number of people in the informal settlements, not only informal settlement, but also in the urban setup. They live below the way lives. But instead of actually evicting people out of all these areas, we had a discussion with Kenya Power that let's start educating the masses on the dangers of living below the power lines. 2, we developed a plan that we go and now identify the areas where the well lift should be. And then 3, we now think of how best we move these people outside this particular area. So resettlement options is not only a matter of the government has to come up with these initiatives. And this is something that they've embraced it, but now with the issue of COVID, I mean, things change. So we have to revisit and then start documenting these. A very critical example, back in 1998 in Bangladesh, where one of our offices is people were resettled back in a place called Jomvu, but apparently they were resettled in a private land that belonged to someone else, so they had to come back. So you find that structure owners became land owners. I mean, tenants became structure owners. From 98 to date, how many years are those? How do you move them back to that piece of land? So these are the basics and the base of which we engage into as we want to move forward. And lastly, the urban renewal and regeneration program, the housing agenda in Mombasa County, this has been key. We've seen that the Mombasa County has came up with this plan. It's a very good initiative. The only impediment is on the issue of access to information on this particular project. How best do we help our county to be able to engage fully with this project and realize its potential? Because housing is critical. Having 72 informal settlements in this county is an eyesore. So how best do we come up with better ideas to do with the issues of urban planning and be able to have informal settlements being upgraded? This is a critical area because housing has been affected greatly, and we find that we've had some successes because out of the 30 communities that we work with in Mombasa, 15 have got court cases. They were sued by private developers. Some of the initiatives from the community are, number 1, is to be able to engage the landowners and have a 50-50 situation, then bring in the county to be able to address this concern on how best can we, the county to have a land bank on the same and use the taxes. I remember Robin Emerson actually said that, how many of us engage in county budgeting process? We do, in partnership with the land network and the governance network in Mombasa. So these are critical areas that we need to think about it. We've had 2 successes. Owinauru, the famous lead community, lead poisoning, we had a matter in court since 2009 until the Supreme Court. Now we moved until to the planning area. And now with planning, the community actually, we're engaging the Ministry of Lands, the political class, because land is a political problem. Secondly, in Miritini, place called Vikobani, we've successfully litigated on that matter. And now we've engaged the county government of Mombasa to start the issue of planning and survey so that we are actually very clear on how best to move forward. So that's just an introduction on what we do. And then we can talk about the critical issues that actually affect the issue of the right to city as we move forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John Paul. And you raised lots of issues from livelihoods and conservation of ecologically sensitive environments to resettlements and again, emphasizing the right to the city. And one of the other things that you talk about clearly is urban regeneration and renewal, which can be used interchangeably depending on the context. And I think it comes at one of the most opportune times in the history of urban development, I would say, as we think about the post-COVID city. You know, things are going to change drastically. And lots of cities from Kisumu to Eldoret to Nairobi, and now you're saying Mombasa, are talking about urban regeneration. At this point, I would like to just bring in again Mwenda back here. I think you've been working on the spatial plan for Tana River County, and in light of the discussions that we are having, how have you been mainstreaming risk planning, or risk-informed planning, if you will, in normative programs of the city? I mean, are there some successes in working with the private sector, with the civil society, and bringing their voices, not just for the sake of planning, but actually, bringing them into urban development decision making?
Thank you so much, Mark. We are actually in the process of preparing the CSP, And I can say, as I mentioned earlier, that these partnerships are very key, from a partnership with the community itself, from the development partners, the civil society, because you remember that even in the spirit of the Constitution, public participation is very key. Otherwise, if you don't alert these people, the people themselves, your partners, and the other organizations on the process, then the product will not be sustainable. So, in terms of now, how are we trying to mainstream this the risk plan management? The issues here, as I have said, are two. And one thing I can say has really helped us is because we are able to use technology to show people what through our risk analysis. We have an operational GIS lab. So we have been able to show maps, for instance, of the risk prone areas and how best can we integrate this in planning of our cities. One, you realize that for us, because of the movement of the flood waters and movement of our livestock, there are two very key aspects that you cannot leave out in when you are preparing your plans. So, so when you look at where is this risk through your analysis, it means you're able to input it in your urban setup. Where, for instance, you cannot, in our case here, you cannot just plan a town without having to plan for a livestock corridor, because these are things that will come in. And because it's a resource-based conflict, these are aspects that you have to put through to as part of risk management. You can also, we can also here when people talk about, for instance, the normal things that, like in planning, you have to have a 9-meter road. Here, a 9-meter road is something very small for us, because the waters that flow here are enormous. You cannot just have, you need quite a big road, for instance, so that you cater for the storm drains. Luckily here we have not had, we are not having quite of the many informal settlements that John Paul is talking about, 72 in Mombasa. So pretty here we can say is a bit green. Let me call it green, although now we have the issue of the poverty levels makes that the kind of development we have here are mostly semi-permanent. So most of the time we find when it rains, some of the houses just crumble and all that. So that's why now we are coming up with issues, engaging various partners across the board to have alternative, what we call alternative building technologies to mitigate on this risk. So the plan, as we are doing the plan, we are looking at how do we mitigate this risk? How do we make these of urban centers sustainable? Because you don't want to have, maybe because of some small items here, you have to rebuild the city again, you have to rebuild the houses, you have a housing crisis. So in that, we are trying to move to another level whereby we are able to make people have a clean and safe living environment, which makes their livelihood much better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I mean, you bring to light lots of things from challenging standards. 9 meters road are not applicable everywhere, and you also talked about risk mapping, which I think is one of the new layers that we are discussing today. And in Kenya also, it's one of those areas that has not been there before. I think for the last 5 years is something that is increasingly being considered by different people. I mean, Joe, if I could come to you to help me tie this together. There are lots of discussions from what John Paul was saying about lack of transparency. He raised an issue with the lack of transparency in sharing information. We have lots of plans being discussed. We know about the Kibera SPA, and there's not so much information about it. And I think not just about Kibera, but lots of different areas. I mean, to the very elusive expressway that we have. The other thing that was also shared by Mwenda is the standards, challenging standards. And I I think all these things come together into what I would look at as governance, the role of governance in urban risk reduction or disaster risk reduction, and planning a resilient city, if you will. So my question to you would be, with your experience and both from practice and research, what do you see as the gaps, or what sort of guidelines do you think we need to scale some of the works that we are doing? I mean, with what KDI is doing, what kind of tools do you think are needed to scale up this kind of actions which are successful?
Thanks, Mark, for that excellent question, and thanks to Mwenda and to John Paul for the illuminating comments. And I think what Mwenda was saying about awareness is a critical one, because to do engagement, to do participation, to work with residents, whether it's in Tana River or in Mombasa, it takes time, and it takes and time is money. It's about investing in processes of engagement. So that's one major point, that we shouldn't talk about participation unless we're willing to invest in it and be real about what it means. The second thing is that I think the critical issue is that maybe on a small public space project of the nature that KDI has been doing, to convene lots of stakeholders at that local scale, to get the different disciplines involved to deliver something, is possible with the funding models that we have. But what does it mean to scale that to the scale of a neighborhood or a settlement or a watershed, in the kind of context that Mwenda's working in? And I think that goes to what John Paul was saying about how do you get urban planning processes in the real into informal areas in particular. So I would say, Mark, that I agree with you that there needs to be more transparency and better information about experiences that have happened in the past. And not everything that happens in Mombasa will be transferable to Nairobi or to Tana, completely different contexts, places, and issues. And yet the more robust evaluation of projects that we can have, I think the more that we can share and learn. And I would even put forward a couple of interesting examples that I think sometimes get buried in the larger political stories. But during the NYS efforts in 2015, there were actually some very interesting investments in infrastructure, in road widening, which were broadly accepted by residents, by structure owners, and were actually transformative to the social and economic fabric of in this case, in Kibera. Another example from that same period was the construction of a large a trunk sewer line along the Gong River by Afi Water Services. And what happened in that project was that a large area of the riparian was cleared in consultation with residents. And it was a huge opportunity, first of all, to provide public health services to a huge population, but also to rethink how that riparian zone could function as a public space, as an access way, as an ecological buffer for flooding. But in fact, what happened was after the sewer line was put in, residents moved back into the riparian zone. And I raised that example because it gets to what I was saying earlier about an integrated approach to infrastructure planning, which brings in urban planning, which brings in urban designers like yourself, Mark, who can see a bigger vision for public space and for the social aspects of the built environment. Because if with that sewer line, there'd been a commensurate investment in river rehabilitation and public space, and residents had been brought along with that vision, perhaps you could have seen a very different, a different idea of the Gong River and the wider Nairobi river basin. So I think that it is important to look at cases and understand what worked and what went wrong. And my final point would just be to, re-emphasize the case of the Mukuru special planning area, because I think that is one where there's been a very rigorous attempt led by the Muungano Alliance and by the Slum Dwellers International, the Kenya Federation, to bring residents into the center of a large-scale planning process. And there's a very good paper by colleagues Joe Maturi and Jack Macau and Patrick Njorage, which is learning lessons from the community-based upgrading of Mukuru. And I think those types of papers are very, very useful in this discussion, with the caveat, of course, that you can't just transplant that process to somewhere else, because the land issues and the demographic and political issues are very different. But the more we can share in that very objective perspective, the more we can learn from different processes. Thanks
so much, Joe. Yeah, thank you so much for raising these issues of awareness, and also highlighting the role of urban planners and designers in creating that shared vision, or looking at it from a spatial strategy perspective, giving a bigger picture of what citywide action might look like. I think oftentimes we focus on size, but then we forget that we are looking at a whole ecosystem. And now, just allow me to bring John Paul again in. John Paul, you've been holding leaders accountable in your sphere of influence, supporting communities at risk. And like you mentioned earlier, Mombasa only has one plan, and you're actually pleading with the Mwenda to come back to Mombasa. In light of this, what role do you see, or what kind of support would you require from the built environment professionals? We have lots of them coming out, but school prepares them for the high level planning and design. They look at those fancy tall buildings in cities, or working with the international development partners. What do you see? What encouragement would you would you give to young urban development practitioners, planners, architects, urban designers?
Thanks, Mark. One, it's good that in our engagement, first, the issue of accountability in this country and basically in the world, it's good to engage the people, the communities that you actually work with. What we do at Haketu is to build human rights communities, but we don't have to do it because it's about them. When they own the process, then ours is provide the technical know-how and how do we move the next level. That has been the most critical bit in us actually achieving results in what we do on the aspect of accountability. And accountability is not only about resources, it's also about information and how you engage with the people, and also as civil society organizations being transparent. Most of us we engage, but we don't want to fully actually disclose who are the development partners, how long we're going to engage. So that's where accountability begins with. Number two, my friend Professor Menya is part of this team. We've engaged with him, and one of the most critical things that the support that is required, the issue of changing the mindset in the coast region. We need to continue to have a continuous public education, so people can understand exactly what is the role of professionals in any process that they engage into. The level of engagement that we've had, there's one element that maybe I didn't mention, the issue of infrastructure projects in this country. If you come to Mombasa currently, we have the Digo Mariakani Road. This is a 42-kilometer road being funded by the African Development Bank and the European Investment Bank and KfW. One critical thing, it brings about critical issues in terms of governance issues and issues of planning and issues of integrity and accountability. We signed a loan of 10.4 billion. We announced a loan of 7.3 billion. How did we use 3 billion to sign a loan, to look for a loan and sign for it? That's a governance question. Kenya has got professionals, the engineers. How do we engage them into community process so they can understand what exactly goes on? The kind of sample that we will think of, the issue of environmental engineers to undertake this. They're actually merely on paper, but when it comes to the actual implementation, then it's a critical question that brings to task. So whom do we engage as professionals? We call upon the valuers. We engage ISK in this county. There are key components that we also engage in land matters. ISPAC. We can't leave the issue of budgeting to accountants. ISPAC needs to come out strongly and be able to look at the financial aspect so that the young engineers that are coming on board, the young planners that are coming on board, how best do we have an integral, how do we integrate the issue of community processes with the science that we have? One critical thing in the informal settlements is, and I know this we've done with Pamoja Trust, is this, the issue of conducting socioeconomic studies. That has been done in Mukuru. Then you let communities actually come up with their, to dream. To dream is actually very critical. How their community is and how they want it to be. Then with that, to bring in the planners now to be able to put the planning component into reality. And this is actually coming up in Mombasa critically, because with Pamoja, we're thinking of 3 communities that we can actually develop settlement development plans that are actually implementable at the end of the day. So the county government, when it comes on board, the work has been done on the ground. So you integrate both. How best do we engage all that we have? So that's basically the kind of support that we think of, the issue of capacity building, the issue of engaging and mapping out all stakeholders. And lastly, to ensure that we don't leave out one actor because we think we're the best. No, we must involve each and every person because the issue of inclusivity is very critical in urban planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this these insights and of course shining a light on the need for cross-sector collaboration. Planners can't do it alone, engineers can't do it alone, and also we need partnership with communities and civil society organizations to hold all these people in governance. Accountable. There's a question on experimentation, urban experimentation. It's more of a comment. One of the participants says that from their experience, they've seen lots of successes with experimentations. I think Joe might know this from the work of KDI, how the city can be used as a living lab for experimenting. How open are we to such innovative approaches or experiments to inform longer-term action? Joe, too.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate this question from colleagues at Avanti, and I think it's a very important one. And I'll actually try and link it to the other question that's been answered asked in the Q&A from Pia around the need for infiltration within cities, going back to the question of drainage as well. I think experimentation is key, and that's absolutely the what I was trying to say earlier about building an evidence base. To experiment is to say more methodically that we're going to try something out. We have an idea about what might happen. We're going to study it, and we're going to look at it and share the results of it. And that's so important for building evidence and examples of what works and doesn't work. And I think actually the question of nature-based solutions and drainage is a very good one for the question of experimentation, because as we've talked about, and both John Paul and Wenda have alluded to as well, it's about the use and the prevalence of housing within the riparian zone, which is actually a really big political land challenge that we have to resolve. And when you look at the kind of theory and the scholarship and also the practical experience with green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, it's very hard to do it at scale because you have to resolve all of these very complex land issues first of all. So there's a scholar, Dr. Patience Gunni at the University of Copenhagen, and she writes a lot about how to experiment with nature-based solutions and sustainable urban drainage systems. And she argues that you should actually start at the local scale where you can control the boundaries, where you can have a clear mandate, where you can have permissions from local government, and show how nature-based solutions and drainage can work at a local scale, experiment, build evidence, and then share those examples to build the case for green infrastructure at a larger scale. And we have a project which is with the Stockholm Resilience Center, which is actually building nature-based solutions in Nairobi and in informal settlements in Dar es Salaam with our partners there in the Tanzanian Federation of Slum Dwellers, and building evidence for their performance. So it's actually an example of experimentation. The last thing I would say is that if you're going to experiment, though, you got to stick around. People don't like to be experimented with. So if you're going to do something, then you better stay put, and you better show some results to people on the ground. And I'm proud in our work that even though I'm far away now in Stockholm, that people from Sri Lanka can still text me and say, hey, this drainage system that you all designed isn't working very well. So accountability to the people that you're working with and trying things out with is very important as well. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. And I just want to reflect again on one of the questions that has been posted on the chat by Pierre. Whose responsibility is it? And at this point, I mean, to ensure that we have adequate spaces for infiltration. And I want to throw a three-sided question to Wenda here. One is whose responsibility is it? Is it the county government? I mean, reflecting on your role as a deputy director for fiscal planning. But then secondly, we are very aware that there are lots of capacity constraints within county government. You could be one person or two people, you know, managing the whole county planning. So what kind of support do you see for, again, young planners, young urban designers, landscape architects in shaping those cities? I mean, not those cities, but your county, in supporting you with the corridor planning. Do you see a role for these young people? I mean, you saw what Joe shared, the mapping and the creative methods that they use in developing their projects. Do you see a role in these young people injecting a little bit of innovation in your processes?
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think to start off from the question of having the spaces, I think it is both the role of the planner and also part of policy, because you realize that we have good plans where planners have actually provided for the green spaces, the areas for the parks and all that. But during implementation, that's where the biggest issue is, because as we are saying is when you're planning with the people, let the people be aware that why we need to have these spaces. And we have come through, you find that there's some of these spaces for infiltration have been taken away by what we call private developers, because maybe you don't have a policy, or we have not made our people aware. Secondly, I'll come to the issue of transparency of what John talked about. As we prepare these plans, let the people know that this is a plan. It's not only a document, but let them see it. Let them visualize what the plan can do to them in years to come. In terms of the role of the young planners, let me say, for instance, here the county is a beneficiary. Because right now I'm working with, I think, 4 young planners, young GIS analysts, cartographers, all of them young, and I can see the benefit of having the ideas, innovation, technology-wise, and I would say that for the counties need to take in these young professionals. For instance, like now, there is a project going down in the Delta where we are talking about landscape restoration. You find it's a concept that is coming through, and you have to have innovative ideas. How are you going about this? And it's important when you have the young guys coming in, having new ideas, they're technology-wise, they're okay, and then boarding with the communities and other partners. And remember, the essence of even having young planners. Remember, succession management is key, because remember, once you only, at times you only say 10 years experience. So I come, I go, but then you want to get another one. But you're not bringing in people up in the system, which is very key. For one, even the institutional capacity, building the capacity of these people, that makes planning more better, rather than just waiting for somebody to get, you want to employ people with experience. No, get these people and we shall bring them up properly in this system. Maybe another thing we would like to bring in this era where we have seen it now happening in our planning forums. We stop planning in isolation, that I am fearing to share a plan with Joe and John because I fear to be critiqued. But critique is key, because that's where you get to get other ideas. This is where you get to know how better can you do. Right now, I've learned something from what Joe is doing in Kibera. I've learned something from John. So let us be progressive, and we are able to make planning better. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Again, I'm just trying to go back to my video after reviewing questions. I think there are lots of questions, but again, we are running out of time. One of the questions is around sustainability and community involvement in ensuring that there's longevity in the projects and interventions that we have. And at this point, perhaps the last question before we close the Q&As. We'll try to type answers and answer type answers to the Q&A, the questions that have been provided. But at this point, I would like to bring John Paul back again. There's this question of sustainability of interventions. How do we ensure that interventions, investments do not go to drain? And what do you see as the role of the community? Oftentimes, we talk about the role of government. The government should do this, government should do this. But then what is the responsibility of the community? How can we involve the private sector? What do you see an opportunity for public, private, and people partnerships in urban development processes?
Thanks, Mark. One, on the issue of sustainability and community involvement, what is critical, and if I can share from what, how we've engaged, because once you've engaged communities, you can't own them. What is important to leave them better, because under issues on social transformation, you need to leave communities better than they were, so that you don't actually do more harm. So one key element is that apart from building human rights communities and communities understanding that they have a problem, this is a social concern that once they understand it, then they're able to ensure that when it comes to interventions, they are part of the solution. Because the problem actually emanates not only from the duty bearer, but also from them. So once they admit that they have a problem and they can change, the issue of mindset plays a critical role in ensuring that communities become part of that solution that we really drive to. An example, we are a church-based, we are based in a church, in a Catholic church setup. And we are being asked a question, how come that we're able to hold the Catholic Church to account when it comes to land issue? You know, the church is the second largest owner of land in this country after the government and of course the private entities. We engage in what we call alternative dispute resolution, because initially missionaries used to invite people to come closer. Now with time, they forgot to secure their parcel of land. When this happens, you find that now people, with the increase in population, people continue to actually amass more wealth and actually acquire the land around it. Now it comes to our attention that as a human rights organization, how best can you address the issue of the church owning land and the people want to be evicted? So this is where we engage in issues of mediation. We've done this for the past 9 months with the Catholic Church, apart from us being part of that particular church. So you find this where the issue of how best do we sustain this process? The issue is, the greatest issue of concern for us is, number one, the community has to agree that there's a problem. The church has to agree that there's a concern that needs to be addressed. And at the end of the day, there's someone that needs to take them through the process, and they've agreed. So sustainability is one part of it, is to be able to ensure that both parties engage in the process. Number two, ensure that when it comes to resource mobilization, both parties will be able to engage in resource mobilization to address the concern. And lastly, to document, because land question in this country, you fail to document, then you are in trouble. People always come with great ideas that, I'm the son of so-and-so. So how do you also deal with intergenerational issues coming on board? Key thing in urban development and the issue of sustainability, the impact of mega infrastructure projects in this country, they've had positive or negative impacts. But let us look at it in terms of how best has it changed the situation in our cities. Number one, the Digo Mariakani Road, this is a loan that me and you, Mark and Mwenda and Kenyan colleagues will pay until 2055. We have a debt to be able to settle. But how best do we utilize this particular component on infrastructure projects? Number one, the communities around have been compensated. There's the issue of compensation, not resettlement. But how best do we look at the livelihood aspect that they have in these particular regions? One is to be able to ensure that communities are involved in all the engagements in terms of the labor, ensure that the 30% of labor that is involved in infrastructure projects goes to the communities. Number two, we have the HIV and AIDS component. How best can they get those tenants to be able to engage those communities in these particular processes? And lastly, what best practice do we talk about in urban development? To me, will be the issue of community development means that however much you engage communities, you also need to tell them the truth, that in this process of urban development, we need to realize that it is our nation. It is our concern as a nation, and we must be part of that. What value do communities add in what we do in day-to-day life? And lastly, whose reality counts? We've got so many reports, but where are they? Do we leave it to the county government and the national government to be able to implement them? Do we take initiatives? Because it is our role as citizens to be able to look at those reports and say, this fits our agenda as a community. Sustainability brings about information, brings about innovative ideas, and brings about issue of community resource mobilization processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Paul. I know we're running out of time. We have 8 minutes to go. I'm just going to invite all of you and give you 1.5 minutes each at most to make your final submissions, or rather parting shots, before we close the session. And then I will just wrap up as we finalize. We could start with Mwenda.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Maybe let me appreciate for being in this session as a panelist. And I think what we are discussing is very important to us planners, to Kenyans, and maybe to other professionals in the built environment. It's a situation where we need to think together in the process of ensuring that our cities are resilient enough and not to be facing these challenges every year in, year out. Because it looks as if we are not planners enough, because it pains to have the same cycle. This happened this year, it will happen again next year. And then, you know, that economically, as we are speaking, and it brings in the sense of a lack of coordination to begin with. And if we are going to put our resources to disaster management and risk issues every year, it means that even our economic development will take a backseat. And what John is talking about us paying our debts, then it means the debts may not even be payable, because we are day in, day out investing in solving disasters other than planning to change them. Secondly, maybe we need to strengthen our communities through partnerships, awareness, and all that, because they are key in whatever we are doing. They say, then finally, maybe I would like to say that we can build on the local knowledge. We as the professionals, it's good to tap into the local knowledge on these the communities we are serving. Remember, they are very key at whatever point of implementation. And if we have to have sustainable livelihoods, we have to go with them together. Otherwise, we shall not be helping our communities. So in that regard, let me say it has been good, and we continue participating in this kind of discussions that build us and also help us serve Kenyans better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mwenda, for really those strong concluding remarks. And at this point, perhaps, Joe, you could come in.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to Mwenda and John Paul for such excellent comments, and to the broader convening, to AAK and Aak-Unhabitat for bringing us all together. And I think in conclusion, I would pick up on something that Mwenda was talking about with regards to the river as a resource. Now, that looks very, very different in the context of Tana versus where KDI has been working, for example, on the Gong River. And yet, I think there's something important there to touch on, which is, you know, when you talk to folk who've lived down by the dam and by Gong River for 20, 30, 40 years, they remember that place very differently. They remember it as a resource. They remember it as a place of relaxation, as a place of beauty. And actually in the last period, that it's become a risk. It's become something to avoid. And so my parting shot would be that we need to work on reclaiming that understanding of nature also in the urban context, and to understand the value and the benefits that nature can bring in the city. So, you know, to connect to what Aak-Unhabitat have been working on with the public space program and looking at public space across Nairobi, I think the idea which comes through strongly there is reclaiming this idea of the green city in the sun, but making sure that it's actually applicable and available to all residents rather than a portion. So that's something that I would want to emphasize. Thanks again for the chance to join you all today.
Thank you so much, Joe. John Paul?
Yes, thanks, Mark. I've seen a question from Dr. Susan Kibwe, asking how do we deal with the land question in the informal settlements? Two things. One, we are currently implementing a project dubbed Housing for Who? Is it for the middle class? Is it for the urban poor? And who are the poor? But with this, what you want to see is that the vulnerable people in the informal settlements have a say in county and national plans. How we do this, we want to involve the political class. In their manifestos, can we have a component on housing? Currently, we've done this in Mombasa County in 5 sub-counties, 1 more to go. And it has really brought in some heated debate that you are inciting the public. You can't go talking about your political ambitions without addressing the housing component. That's the campaign that we are driving currently. We can't leave the housing agenda to the county government and then use it as a political tool without adding value to it. So the land question in Mombasa and the informal settlements, how we deal with it is we engage the county government, we engage ISK and the valuers in conducting research. And in this research, you're able to identify the parcel numbers and who owns what. In Mombasa County, we have a lot of beaches. Who owns the first line? That's what the critical question is. How we deal with that is there's a research that we have conducted in partnership with Pamoja Trust, and we can share that report with the team to see the array of parcel numbers and the issues that have come on board. Lastly, I think I'm grateful for this session, and we're able to discuss more as we look at, when you talk about whose role is it to be able to bring change. For the young urban planners, you're most welcome so that we can give you a taste of the informal settlements in Mombasa and what are the issues that we can think of. Lastly, I'll just maybe ask everyone, I mean, all those that are part of this team, the issue of infrastructure projects and the issue of valuation. Who is supposed to be given a valuation report? Are you as an individual entitled to a valuation report in line with access to information in mega infrastructure projects? Or is it only the role of the valuers to retain this report for their own use? Maybe you can think of that as we move along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John Paul, really, for highlighting lots of these things, these issues, from awareness creation to the role of the built environment professionals, which is actually, around civic education as well, more than design and more than imagining the city. It's about, acting more like a mediator between the government and the people, and heightening awareness. Before I invite Juliet to wrap up this session, I would like to try and summarize what we discussed into around four key points. One was transdisciplinary and cross-sector collaborations, which came out clearly, from what Joe started with, how KDI works, to what Mwenda talked about corridor planning and working with different sectors within the county, to what John talked about, from livelihoods to conservation of ecologically sensitive areas to heightening awareness. And the second point that I would say is also one of the key takeaways here is the need to embrace innovative approaches, including experimentation. From such ideas as negotiated development, basically calling on the built environment community of practice to come down from the ivory towers, to collaborate with communities, to hear what communities have to say. They have a lot of knowledge. How can we tap into the knowledge of these communities? I think that was really, really important. I think one of those key things that also was echoed from various people, reflecting on the previous session as well, is the need to document practices. I think documenting of practices, innovations, and this goes to such things as data. What kind of data? And reflecting on questions like housing for who? What kind of data are we collecting? What kind of socioeconomic survey are we collecting? What kind of data? What kind of socioeconomic survey are we carrying out? And I think here one of the other things that was really clear is that we need to rethink our indicators for this kind of data. I mean, we are not going to, measure the city by the height of buildings, but then quality of life. So we need to think about that. And lastly, is the question of governance in all this. Governance, again, ties all these things together, ensures the right to the city by respecting the right of the people to the city, especially the most vulnerable people. And then, valuing community voices in urban development decision-making. But most importantly, sharing of information and ensuring transparency. We need to share information. We need to hold people accountable. I think those are really some of the key things that I wanted to also share here. And then last thing that I'm just reminded of, reflecting on what Joe said, that we need to rewild the city. We need to bring nature back into the city. It needs to come back at the center of urban planning and design. If we are to design or build a multi-hazard resilient cities, it needs to be at the center. Over to you, Juliet, to close the session for us.
Thank you very much, Mark. You've summarized the session very well. I feel I don't need to add anything in terms of what we have learned from the session. Just to reiterate that all these contributions are I almost don't want to leave this afternoon session. I almost want the conversation to continue. And really, it also brings out to the issue that I think we also don't engage as much on topical issues as professionals, as experts in our areas of expertise, to really bring out even what we are doing individually in our organizations, our new thoughts, our new approaches. And I'm very grateful for these opportunities that has been created by the UTC just for everyone just to come on board and really engage. And going by the discussions that we have yesterday and the discussions that we have had today, I can only say that we have very good points that we can action. We have learned new terminologies, new words. We've been called, is it disaster tourists? We just go check and do nothing. We have been called now to act. We've been called as professionals to even engage in politics. Not been told us by the nature of our profession, especially planning, we are in politics because we control resources. So we really have to really take it up as professionals, as experts in our area of contributions, wherever we are, to see how we can come up with actions that can move us forward. And that's really what we have to do tomorrow. So tomorrow morning session, we just have two sessions in the morning. We will hear the results of the urban labs. They will make presentations of their findings and their discussions from yesterday. And then we will have a brainstorming session, a very interactive session where we agree on the action areas, we agree on the points that we want to take forward so that we can then see which areas of actions we can take up wherever we are and how we can be held accountable for our areas of action per se. So it's very interactive session, and I wish to thank all of you, the panelists who have been with us today, the audience who have been very patient with us, even as we extend a bit beyond the time that we had set for today's session. Thank you very much for your time, for your inputs, for your knowledge, for all your comments. And I hope to see you again tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the closing session. Thank you very much. And this is the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliet. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, John Paul.
Thanks, Juliet. Thanks all, John Paul.
Thank you, Joe.
Bye.
Bye.